Matthew Allison. How are you, sir? Are you
how
doing all right? I hope.
how wonderful it is. I like the fact that I like that we don't quite know if it can be done yet, and yet there are deadlines and dates on the calendar where others expect us to be present. But will we be out of the ground? Yeah. I mean, it's wonderful in a way. And
Mm.
then the other one is golf. So this also relates to grass, I suppose. I'm a golfer. I've at least taken up golf
Good for
in the last
you.
few months after playing with my dad around. All it takes is one shot where the ball is in the middle of the face of the club and you feel it go through your arms up to your shoulders. And it is a communication, a
Mm.
physical one, a biomechanical one, but it also feels like another level or kind of signal. And so I've been mildly obsessive about that, but using it as a buffer between driving for work and going to the play practices. Sometimes I swing the club so hard that nothing can faze me. There could be holes in the roof. There could be certain characters not in attendance, but I might have forgotten my line, but I'm so exhausted I can't do much more than respond.
Mm.
I can't
Mm.
over determine my response with worry or all the psychological nuances of unused, undiverted, unproductive energy.
Mm. I think that's wonderful. I think it's wonderful that you do drama. I think it's wonderful you've taken up golf. I don't know if we do enough as a culture, as of a society, to really push people, especially in the mid years or as they get older, to take up things like that. There's something about just, doing golf, even if you're not going to be a professional, the pure excess and the pure choice of it, there's something to this I'm going to do that I think actually, in a way, I think about this. When you're young, very often you do sports, yes, but it gets blurred with the resume or it's what the other kids are doing. But when you're older, there's no doubt there's a certain purity to it, or it certainly approximates it, right? And I think that's very powerful and something communal. I did choir. We went on the East Coast, Jubilate. This time of year, we'd be getting ready for Christmas. We'd probably be doing. I remember one year we did the Rudder Requiem, which is Rudder's one of my favorites. And I remember doing that. I really liked it. And there were some people in some of the choirs who were in their 80s who had been doing choir for 40 years. And that's, why? Because, and there's a certain fullness of character that seems impossible without that certain choice that exceeds any framework other than the giving yourself over to it. And I do think it's powerful. Now, of course, there's the version of it that is distraction. How do I distract myself and avoid the existential terror? But then there's also something where it's like, actually, there's some impossibility of occupying myself if I don't do these kind of activities. There's some impossibility of occupying my body in a kind of fullness and a full created creation sense if I don't do these kind of things. I think about that a lot. Like, how do you tell the difference between the activity where you're like, yeah, I need to do this to enter into a certain fullness, and the activity that is the avoiding of existential dread? Because I think those get blurred, but I don't think they're the same. I don't think they're the same. And I think about that difference a lot. Like, really kind of be like, actually, there's something about doing this that's really important. There's something actually about it that really matters. And I should also mention that, and these are just thoughts, and I love the Harry and the Smooth conversation as well, the wells, everything you mentioned in the emails. Those are all wonderful. I did putt-putt for 6 years, like and I actually went to nationals twice. I never did golf, but I could hit that ball on a little funny putt-putt course and get into the hole quite a bit. And actually, one time, because I guess that's when I was like, I don't know, 10 to maybe 15, maybe 16. And then I did wrestling and cross country. And then the arcade had a DDR machine, Dance Dance Revolution. And I did maybe or maybe not have a period of really enjoying hitting those arrows with my feet as quickly as possible. And the other putt-putt golf people would join me on it. But no, I do think about that. Like what does the person gain, like that man who's been doing choir for 40 years? What is it you gain in the gardening or the golf that you feel throughout your body? I think about that. And then I also just think I think drama is really cool. I think plays are just like amazing. So I think that's really cool that you do that. So those are some thoughts that come to mind. But it's always a pleasure to see you, Matthew. And again, I salute you for doing it. I mean, like it's just interesting because like sometimes too, I do wonder. There's all the talk of nihilism and the meaning crisis and different things. I'm like, maybe you should join a choir. Maybe you should, it's like maybe you should take up golf. Maybe it is interesting, but then again, sometimes I feel like that's avoiding the existential dread to say that, quote unquote. But then there's other times where it's like, no, that's actually the correct thing to do, to take up something that brings you into a space. So, anyway, those are just some thoughts.
Wonderful. So a few things come to mind. We could be Heideggerians for a moment. We could talk about Jacob and Esau for intervals. We can continue on hopping on anecdotal stones and bringing up our own personal details, or we could do all three. We have time, and you have a cup and I have a cup. Let's take time.
Yes, sir.
Heidegger first, and then I would like your thoughts. Being in time, his use of the word concern
Mm.
and concerning. So let's have fun with matters of concern. What I'm hearing from you is existential dread can be, and perhaps there's a whisper of an ought to be, concerning to
Mm.
us or to the human being. Existential dread should be concerning. But then the question is, if we grant that premise, that existential dread to the human being should be concerning, what does it mean for something to concern? Notice I'm using it as a verb, not as an adjective. Oh, that's concerning. But what is it to concern? Not conserve, not coerce, but to concern. And Heidegger plays with the ambiguity and almost nullity of the conveyance of the word concern by making it a philosophical, technical term in being in time. And what's neat about concern is it can go around. So it's a describing. So it's what's that little thing that makes the circles in a perfectly geometric way? Compass?
You put the pen down and you like draw it. Oh,
So there are two parts in this component. One stays in place. It's the totem. It's the center of the universe or of the paper. And then that which, here we go, describes the position of that not moving piece by going completely around it, concerning itself with that which does not move, that is componentially joined to it. But from the perspective of the thing standing still, that thing is always in front of it, no matter which way it turns. That's the definition of the describing circle. So we're finding that describing, as in with this pictorial image, the perfectly surrounded circular point, this description also is a definition, because it's bringing into finitude what otherwise would just be a blank piece of paper, or by extension, infinity. No description is now constrained by the description, which is always revolving around itself. So this is an abstract way of thinking about definition. Aristotle defined the methodology of defining things by taking parts and putting them together and saying that the together parts are something greater than those parts together, but without which those parts would not have a togetherness.
Mm.
So a human being has the parts of a mammal, but it walks on 2 feet, and that differentiates it, gives it a separate circle
Right.
where it revolves around its own description than a tiger, even though they share mammalian wider circle concern. So the idea of circle and circle and circle and smaller circles and epicycles of circles outside circles, that's a graphical way of thinking about genus and species, or of definitions and then definitions in definitions, or systems and subsystems. Whatever language you want to use, this is a way of talking about difference between things that are underneath a common sameness. So the four-legged animal and the two-legged animal can be under a common sameness, a common wide circle known as mammals, if they both happen to be mammals. But what differentiates them, makes them smaller circles in that bigger one, is the one we call human being, because the parts that make, visible and invisible, by the way, that make a human being, and human being is the word that describes the togetherness of those parts: 2 legs, 2 arms, speech. And some of those parts don't find themselves in togetherness with a 4-legged dog. Now, if we want to, we can be spooked by that, because the more you talk about it in an analytical way, you find that, okay, I can say the words, the parts, the togetherness, the concerning, but I don't understand why the name human being describes the togetherness of the parts and not the togetherness of the parts of the 4-legged dog. And if we live with that tension for a split second or more, then we become philosophers, or we say, whoa, that needs to be outsourced somewhere. And we find a ritual that does outsource it and give it back to us in a reflected manner. And partly, and this is my belief, that is what drama does. It thinks for us. It is our own reflection if we were to take time, but it has taken the time for us to then present that reflection in real time, and invites us into, as it were, the first place where we could have begun elaborating our own thoughts and finding them ourselves. It is a technology drama of describing what is concerning.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the definition of drama, is it not? Describing what is concerning. Thoughts, my friend?
Well, I'm quite taken by that metaphor of this, where it draws the circle. And that's kind of interesting because compass is also what you use to find your direction, right? So it's interesting, like, how do you find your direction? And it's interesting how then the stability serves the circling. Like the stability of the center point is in service of the circling. And the circling is possible because of the stability. And actually, it's impossible to imagine. I mean, it's really difficult to draw a perfect circle. Yeah, I didn't. Without that stable, I didn't do it. It's not perfect. Like, you need that stability to have the drawing, right? And it's interesting because the stability, like if you had the compass and it was just a point, it would just be a point. But it's interesting how the stability is serving the circling. But it's interesting because the stability would just be kind of a point that didn't bring anything into relationship if it didn't also coexist with the circling. And it's interesting because Like there's a way in which maybe concern, if we make like there's the concern and care in Heidegger, there are these kind of ideas. If I think about care, like we are caring beings, that we can also use the word concern. These are things that concern us versus not. Then it's interesting because there's something concerning to us. And I'm almost now thinking, just to play on the words, like it takes care to draw that circling, to make a definition, to kind of determine what's going to be included within the human being. You have to have a certain art to do that well. And maybe what concerns us is what enters into that circling, what falls within that circling, and if it should be there or not. And it's almost like, too, that if you don't have a stable point, you can't make a circle. And if you can't make a circle, you also can't figure out how to direct your life, what to direct your life toward, or to figure out what should concern you or not, right? And it's kind of interesting because when I do think that, like you mentioned, definitions do seem to be more like that compass. Like a definition is we have a stable thing called a human precisely so that we can draw a circle in which all these phenomena are included, right? But the circle is weird because the circle is possible because of the point, but when you lift the compass, you don't draw a point. It's like the point is not even there. It kind of vanishes, right? And yet the point is what made possible the drawing of the circle, right? And so there's this interesting thing where when you experience a human being, the word human drops away. You just have kind of the range of phenomenon that's included in that. And yet maybe the whole reason you're even able to approach the human being is because you have the words human by which to make it intelligible and to kind of come toward them and thus include them in your circle. And it does seem like thought is a kind of mixture of a stability in service of a circling, but a circling around a stability. But the stable is for the sake of the action, and the action in its very perfection is a testament that there must have been a stability there, right? Like if there's a perfect circle, oh, well, there's no way you free-handed that. You must have had a stable point from which to draw the circle. And yet, you don't see the point, which is kind of interesting, right? Like you conclude there must have been a point. Yeah, you conclude there must have been a point because the circle is perfect, because it works so well, and yet you don't see that, right? And I do think that kind of speaks to the mystery of language, right? You're like, wow, this works really well, but where's the point at which the word human arose? You look around, it's like, I don't see it. Or like the point that the experiences come from, and you don't see it. And yet you have this sense of there must have been because this works so well. It kind of things fit into it so well, which then makes me think the form, as we've spoken about, the Platonic form that goes about this kind of sense of, oh, this works really well. So there must have been a point that was drawing all that. And then kind of the drama of human experience is one, the making of the circle, the realization there must have been a point. What is the point? It's a vanishing point. How do we move toward it? Because it must have been here for this circle to be so perfect, and yet now it's not, and yet being toward it seems to be important for the formation of the human being. And then I wonder if, like, taking up choir or taking up putt-putt or these different activities are somehow activities of searching for that point, to have a sense of this, of what made that circle, because then there's more circles that could be made. So those are some thoughts that come to mind to start.
Well, it goes back to how mathematics is invented. Mathematics is a language for ratiocination. So the beginning of that ratio, 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 it is a language that, just like rappers, their words are semi-meaningless because they're using the vowels and consonants that and the feeling of rapacious, nonplussed puncturing of air that is a polysyllabic word devoid of semantics. So when a rapper is in a flow state, they're not, in my opinion, recapitulating a dictionary. this word, that word, I'm making this prose composition, and basically this is Henry James. They don't do that. I don't think the phenomenon of the rap artist is a recapitulation or representation of prose composition, because they're in a flow state, and they have this wonderful idiomatic expression, off the dome. It's all spilling over and it's on top, and I don't know what that means. It means many things at once. But because it can mean many things at once, the meaning is beside the point. They're using those some monosyllabic, some polysyllabic words to ride the beat and not leave gaps. So it's a para-technical device, the rap. It's parasitic. I don't mean that as a flu,
Sure.
but it has a site beside wherever the drums are, or a snare, some kind of beat, which is what? A catching or riding of time, of silence, then sound, then silence, then sound. That difference. There's a togetherness of parts that we do not hear, and those parts that we do not hear are brought into a togetherness which concerns itself and finds inherent interest in itself and is formed and answers to the name silence. In the same way, mysteriously, there is inherent interest in being itself so far as the parts that come together in a togetherness answer to, in a formal way, the name sound. And those two forms of togetherness are not the same. Their parts might be shared, but the collection of parts known as sound, their togetherness is not the togetherness of the parts, some of which are shared by sound, that come together to make silence. Because there's some sound that we don't hear that dogs do. So this barring, like the rap artists say, they have bars, man. They're dropping bars. This barring of silence and sound, they bring monosyllabic and polysyllabic words, mostly devoid of semantics, to participate in or come together as parts and reveal a togetherness that answers to the formal name. Aristotle famously said, there is no name for this verbal art. We do not have one for it. We have a name for the lyric poet or the tragic poet, but one who just uses the verbal art, we have no name for, which I take to mean it's not a settled ontology, what rap artists are doing by riding the beat with their many syllabic words. And in that same way, it's always open-ended and therefore best expressed extemporaneously. The best raps are extemporaneous. But Bach is best not extemporaneous.
Right.
So the one answers to a name, the other, as a verbal art, answers to no name. When you putt-putt and I go to the driving range determined to let out a lot of acid throughout my muscles so that I forget a lot of things. Not that I'm depressed or anxious, but I just don't want to think for a little while. So I'm going to make it so physiologically I can't make too many thoughts ride whatever environment I happen to be in.
Right.
The polysyllables of thought turn into monosyllables after a session at the range. So too, these little activities, do they participate in the Bach formality of being named, or do they participate in the verbal art, which Aristotle said has no name?
Yeah.
And therefore, is best cultivated extemporaneously.
Yep.
Where do you bottleneck my either or?
That's very interesting. And perhaps part of the issue of avoidance of the existential dread, maybe you're one taking up activities when you're not exploring the other side. So if I were to say Bach versus the no name, maybe you've gone through Bach and you kind of have a sense that you need to move to the no name and you don't want to, so you do activities to avoid that. Whereas maybe you do the no name or the rap and you realize there's something in the Bach you need to get the game, but you avoid that. So maybe there's something there with it because there seems to be, if there's something about the stability affords the circling, and the circling is the testament to the still point of the compass, the still point T.S. Eliot there, then there's something about a failure to really grasp what you're ultimately caring about unless there's some sort of activity of both that needs to be partaken in some sense, right? And I do think maturity is some sort of like real maturity, not merely maturity in the sense of now you have to do the laundry, but a spiritual maturity entails some sort of groping for the sense of what you don't have yet or need to develop, like this kind of groping. You can't fully articulate it, but you're groping it out and you're following it, not by sight, but by faith. You're kind of feeling it through, right? And there is something where the no name, the ramp, what's interesting, an image I had in mind is some of the Mandeville paintings, or maybe Wolfram or Computation Autonoma. Like there's this idea that if you start with a simple set, it can unfold into a complex, or the Mandeville pictures, right? Very mysterious, where if you take simple computation, you get these beautiful images, right? These beautiful images do not have the complexity of the Mona Lisa, but there's still a revelation in the Mandeville pictures or the Wolfman. The fact that simply a certain allowing the thing to unfold, a certain fidelity to the process, a certain trust to the process, and then you have this kind of miraculous image. And the one would not probably hang a Mandelbrot painting, and he's famous for doing weather patterns and all this different stuff, and Nassim Taleb likes him, and I think he was at the Institute for a while. The Wolfman. One would not hang these pictures up in their room, probably, compared to perhaps a Van Gogh or something, and yet there's something important to them. Like there's some testament to them, and yet there's also some sort of revelation to the Van Gogh or the Bach, or there's some sort of revelation that if you don't learn whatever it is both of them are giving to you, there's some sort of problem that can emerge. There's some sort of deficiency that can emerge. And what's interesting, I guess the question then becomes, is the still point the Mandelbrot painting and the wrap and the circling the Bach, or is the circling the wrap and the still point the Bach, right? Like which is which? Both of them seem to afford the possibility of the other, but there is a way in which it's almost as if precisely because things can unfold like the rap song or the Wolfman images can unfold from simple rules, then it becomes possible to do a Bach. It becomes possible to do, which then, funny enough, I guess means every still point is pregnant, like with possibility. Even a still point can from itself unfold, or an entire image can come out of it. That even from just one word, a rapper can take a single term, repeat it, rap, rap, here I'm going to, and then they actually can get the beat from the one word and then make a sentence and then the rhyme, just like a Wolfman, just like an automaton with a single note. Whereas it doesn't seem like with Bach, you can hit the B, the B, the B. It's like there seems to have to be something more than just hearing the B. Bach seems to have to come with something more, maybe, although I don't want to speak too much to having a deep understanding of his creative process. I suppose Bach did, and God, and the rest of us just enjoy Saint Matthew's Passion. But it is interesting how what's the difference between the rapper who goes the rap, here comes the beat, like that in Bach who's sitting down to compose something in its entirety. That's very interesting to me. But there might be something here, and then I'll give it to you, where it does suggest that, grace abounds, because even if all you've got is the word rap, from that you can unfold a creation. But then also if you have, the infinite universe of Bach's genius, you can also get creation, right? So if from a single word, a single beat, you can unfold an entire rap off the dome, then there's no point where we as human beings are entirely lost, where a creative unfolding is not possible, because from a single beat with the right ability and the right skill, you can make an entire rap, right? Well, if just from one word that can happen, then we never have to be worried about being stranded from a place where we can't build up from that. And so maybe there's something about care, which is where you're looking at things to unfold as such, or you're working from this expanse of Bach, maybe, whereas avoidance is when you're focusing on the word rap and want to keep it there. You don't want it to unfold. You don't want it to get away. You just want to kind of keep it contained. You want to keep the point from becoming a pillar to draw a circle. You just want it to stop there because you're anxious and you're tired. You want to just kind of keep it simple, right? As opposed to having a circle be drawn. Well, a circle is open. It's a range that you can explore. Much nicer if it just stays at a point. Well, when you do that, well, you're also living in a falsity, because if an automaton, a single word, a single point can expand into an entire song, then if you try to stay in a point and keep it that way, it's false. It's a privation, because that's not the logic of creation. Every atom, every point of creation entails an unfolding, well, for Leibniz monad, a situation that would be unfolding out of it. So it's very interesting in the rap example, where from a single word, it is more monadic in the Leibniz. It's more of an unfolding situation. And maybe actually that's, if there's a grace to come from the idolatry of reductionism, where we've lost sight and we start saying, no, Bach isn't real, the full song isn't real, the single note is real. Well, if there's a grace to come from that, maybe that in coming to that place, suddenly when all hope is lost, we go, actually, from the single word, an entire rap song can come. Actually, from the single point, an entire monadic state. So even if we reduce ourselves into the nihilistic point of radical reductionism that defines the meaning crisis, as Vervaeke calls it, even there's enough to make an entire rap song. So maybe there's a kind of grace in that point. And then if that's true, then putt-putt, golf, or drama, or choir, all of these could be potential points of unfolding, right? So then the question becomes why one is drawn to this point for an unfolding versus another, or different things. But those are some thoughts that come to mind.
Saint Maximus comes to mind alongside what you said regarding the situation. So Saint Maximus, in one of his letters, said that we apprehend Genesis, and he's using that word as an item of philosophical grammar, not necessarily the narrative in the Bible. We apprehend the origin of something, where it comes from. So the first word out of the rapper's mouth, where does it come from? What is the first word out of the rapper's mouth's genesis? He says we apprehend, and that word apprehend is important. The way, if you walk into a garden, a number of things happen in order. One, you notice, let us say, an apple. That is to say, you pick it out from the sensory field, and you pick it out by sensing particular attributes, which somehow are with the togetherness that the name apple formulates. So not everything is going on, but some things are going on to lead to the conclusion that I have noticed the apple. That is one kind of taking in. And this is what painters can spend their art representing to us. because an artist doesn't give you something. They give you the taking in of something. They don't give you the thing, they give you the taking in of the thing. So they look at the grids on a two-dimensional space as the place, the zone, where they can represent the taking in to this already in. Because when you look at the two-dimensional plane, wood, paper, whatever material, that already is an IN. That's a thing that whatever material they put on it, that material is in it. It's framed by it. It is upon it. It interacts in those ways with. It is in. What they want to do already with those mechanical constraints of it having to be in insofar as it is upon, surrounded by, is they want to use that mechanics as the occasion also to represent what it would be like to take in the experience of walking in the garden and seeing the apple. So they're using the occasion of different pigments being in an easel that is upon it, surrounded by it. They're using that mechanical, physical in also to double as a aesthetic, experiential taking in of walking in a garden and seeing an apple. The problem is those two circles are mutually exclusive. The painting of the apple tree is, and it should come as a winter burst. The painting of the apple tree is, do you see how the icicles falling from my teeth? The painting of the apple tree is not an apple tree. And there is no way around it. But if it is, and I have no idea what this means, done well, then the painting of the apple tree takes in what it would be like to take the apple tree at face value, that is through my own eyes of my face. But it doesn't preclude the mutual exclusion of those two circles, of those two forms of togetherness.
I'm quite taken by the idea of trying to communicate the taking in. I think that's very good. Hans Rockmacher once said, and I really like Hans Rockmacher, he was friends with Schaeffer, and he had this line where he said, reality is fact plus meaning. And he basically was really studying, he wrote this book on modern art, where he's basically like, yeah, we're dead. Like the death of civilization is tied to modern art because art is a kind of litmus test of the spiritual state of the society. And really what he was saying, what you see in a lot of the modern art is no effort to get at reality because there was no effort to bring together fact plus meaning. It was either pure fact or no meaning, when reality is fact plus meaning. But what I like about what you were saying is that meaning is tied to the taking in process. Meaning is not definition, it is the taking in, but the fact is the taken in. Well, reality is the bothness of the taken in with the taken in, right? And art is trying to communicate the taking in. And if you do not communicate that, you don't communicate reality. And there's a few things that come to mind with that. First, there is something about rap in the freestyle off the dome that seems really close to the simultaneous activity of the making and the made together. Like your live experience, as they're taking it in themselves, it's really close to the raw creative process. Like they don't even know what they're about to say, and then they do. So you feel like you're really close to the core of the experience of taking in and giving the taken in, right? So that's why there's a reason there's power to it. But also I'm thinking about Bach, and one of the reasons why someone like Bach, in my opinion, the best of Bach, say St. Matthew's Passions, but you really feel like in those at those particular moments in Bach, you feel like you're really close to the inspiration of it. Like you feel like you're close to what? The heavenly vision, right? That's when Bach's at its best. When you feel like you're really like when you really feel the emotion or the inspiration of the work come through, there is something about that moment that feels like you're in the shoes Bach was in when he was taking in the experience of this music in his own mind, right? Those seem to be the most powerful moments of art. And, whether one agrees or not, Tolstoy in his essay, What is Art, was like, hey, the function of art is to communicate an emotion. Which you say, well, that's simple. He's like, no, it's like the hardest thing in the world because it's the taking in. He's not just saying happiness. He's like, no, I'm talking about the taking in of the human experience. That's what by the word emotion, I think Tolstoy is far closer to that of what you're saying, the taking in experience. He's like, you're trying to communicate the taking in. And you say, that's impossible. And he's like, you know, you know, it's and that activity of communicating the taking in, that seems to be getting at what the function of art is, and like if humans don't have a sense of that or get bad at taking in because then they don't have reality. They have too much fact or they have too much disembodied meaning, and they don't have the reality for Hans Rockmacher, which is fact plus meaning, right? And that seems to require the taking in. I say that as well because, like, when you're talking about the apple and there's this kind of taking in all these things coming together, you mentioned mathematics with the compass. And there is a sense where you're like, all this math works so well. The circle is so perfect. There must have been a point, a Platonic point. There must have been a perfect point, right? Likewise, you're like, wow, I really take in this apple in such a successful way. And I really feel like I'm taking in reality. There must be some point here that makes this possible, and yet it's a vanishing point. That's why I like this compass metaphor a lot, because it's a vanishing point. The circle is a testament to a vanishing point, right? Like, and then I guess in painting, the vanishing point is the furthest where isn't it where the perspectives converge or something? Like it's the point where and it's interesting because it's like the perfect circle draws your eyes to a certain convergence where it vanishes. Like the painting goes off, it feels like, at a vanishing point. It goes beyond itself. But it's, of course, not beyond itself because the painting is right there. It's not beyond itself, right? That sense of when you experience the apple and it all comes together and there's a vanishing point, you feel and this is probably, I mean, this is, I think, what Plato and they're kind of describing. There's this sense that your mind already is going beyond just this, but what is it going beyond to? And it's almost like it's going beyond, not away from it, but to the taking in itself. And maybe that's the practice. Like we have to keep our mind focused on the taking in versus letting it trail off. I'm thinking about differences now between taking in and trailing off, and what are the practices that help us take in versus trail off? And maybe that's a difference between existential distraction and care, right? Like coming to where we're taking in versus trailing off. But let me give it to you.
That was excellent dichotomy. So taking in and trailing off. I think we could map Isaac and Esau onto the taking in and trailing off. But I don't want to do that yet. Isaac was a man of tents, a plain man, simple, loved by his mother. That to me seems to be taking in. Esau, a man of the field, a subtle hunter, gave venison to his father. This is why his father loved Esau. That seems to be a trailing off. But why is it a trailing off? without a negative connotation. Why is that a trailing off? I don't know. So I won't go further afield or further in with respect to Jacob or Esau and Jacob. But you anticipated Saint Maximus. When we apprehend being, he says, that is to say, when we apprehend the origin of being, Genesis in Greek, we simultaneously apprehend that is, when we're walking in a garden and we notice an apple, that taking in is logically, prior to the decision, which can go one of two ways, of picking or dismissing and walking away. That decision to take or not to take is downstream from the taking in of the existence of the apple. Here we might be Kantian. The a priori condition for the possibility of deciding whether or not I take the apple at all is that I apprehend. Grasping is a nice Anglo-Saxon word for the Latin comprehending. In my mind, they're synonymous.
Yeah.
So an a priori condition for the possibility of comprehending the apple, that is, an a priori condition for grasping the apple, is apprehending the apple. So there's a taking before the possibility of taking. This will sound Hegelian, because now it sounds like the later taking circles back into the prior taking. And now it's a circle, ever reversing, ever revolving, ever recognizing the flavors and nuances of this initial act that is the final act, that is the most efficient act, that has been all around us this whole time, and that now we're at the summit of in our absolute knowledge for this thing that will now be generated into a set of laws that will then reflect upon themselves into a set of character types that will then conflict with one another and become a state, a state of affairs. Okay. But I think he's repeating himself in a Mandelbrot way with this initial noticing of the difference between apprehending and comprehending. And I am of the mind that apprehending comes first, logically. Maybe not in a way you could time with a stopwatch. I apprehend, and then 5 milliseconds later, I consciously decide whether or not to grab that apple because it looks good. But logically, one is prior to. Now, why does this matter that the cart is behind the horse, that apprehending is prior to comprehending? Well, it matters because of what you said about the invisible or vanishing point. So Saint Maximus said that when we apprehend Genesis, we apprehend kinesis, motion, the Greek word for motion. He says that we cannot apprehend being and where being comes from without also at the same time apprehending that being in motion. Now, a person could say, my eyes are glazing. It sounds like you're saying words. You're not making an argument. Well, it's subtle, I think, because what he does with that collapse of movement and being, is he being Parmenides here? Is he being Heraclitus here? Can't step into the same river twice because it's all motion. All being is motion and motion being. No, because he has providence, which is a circle. Now we're circling back to some earlier terms from the same conversation. Providence is a wider circle that includes these two smaller circles of being and motion, and keeps being in motion and motion in being while keeping them distinct. How? Logically. Now, providence for him is a personal relationship. It's the providence of God over the beings he makes and keeps in being by bestowing on them and endowing them with proper behavior that is according to their particular set of parts in togetherness that answers to a single name. The fact that dogs walk a certain way and humans another, Saint Maximus would say, is due to providence, loving both so much that he will not allow either to be confused. Now, you could look at that in a moralistic way, or you could look at it as a metaphysic.
Yeah.
And the moment we start to take in how to take in is when metaphysics becomes exciting again.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because if we forget how to take in what we are taking in, then we are simply taking in, which means we are being primed at the pump for sensationalism.
Yes, yes.
For whatever fad is around the corner, whatever exotic way someone is using a set of terms, whatever bucket of paint is being thrown against a wall in an art exhibit, whatever. That of the moment of the day, ephemera, which catches our eye, will be called art. But that simply is a sign that we have forgotten how we are taking in what we are taking in. We forgot to ask the question, what is it to take in? We already know we're taking in, but we've forgotten what it means to take in. So it's a riff on Heidegger's what is it to be? What does it mean to be? What does it mean to take in what we are taking in?
Yeah.
Now that sounds like an abstraction, but to my mind, abstraction is left to right. What it means to take in what we're taking in, that seems right to left. It's a step out of the frame, and not a step sensually into the frame. Renaissance paintings are sensual steps into the frame. Lifelike depictions. I can see the muscle in tension. It looks so lifelike. That makes us, over time, if it's our steady diet, forget that we are creatures which can take in.
Yeah. Yes.
But if the painting does so much work for us, then we forget our capacity and we accept the painting as the capacity. This is where the art of exhaustion and maximalism comes in as the Renaissance. Obsession with lifelike verisimilitude. It makes the painting the stand-in for the capacity. Versus a proper vanishing point makes your intellect, which I'm using synonymously with the soul, ride the lines that a hand has traced upon the surface mechanically. It's making your eye act like the hand which beforehand made the line that now is hidden by the pigments and color. Let's say it's a field, but really all that field is in a painting is a number of lines which have been drawn by a hand. But because they're hidden through the artful manipulation of color that makes you think you're seeing a field, your eye is being taught how to, this is so beautiful. In my opinion, this is so neat that paintings do this. Your eye subconsciously is being tutored to act like the hand which drew the lines that now are being masked by the paint, which looks like a flower in a field. But your eye is moving across the line that is that flower, which is hidden by the color. And because it's subconscious, you don't know that that eye is moving along the line the hand has made, which means that the eye is acting like the pen, acting like the forefinger, reproducing the drawing, reproducing the kinesis, the action, reproducing in the observer as an imprint, following that line artfully to the vanishing point, which by its function pushes the eye out of the frame of the painting. And now, because the eye has been so close to what the hand was doing, it is shocked and surprised. And this is where it jumpstarts the soul, the intellect, to say, oh, I see what you did there. And just like the rapper rides the beat with the polysyllables, the eye rides the hand, the intellect now rides the eye out of the painting and recognizes itself as able to take in whatever the environment puts in front of it in its ever-increasing circle of influence. If the art has our good as its end. If it doesn't, then it will train us to never let our eye drift off so that the soul can take over. It just wants that eye, man.
Yeah.
That's pornography.
Yeah.
That's material pornography, which is just a bunch of soup cans.
Yeah.
A bunch of sensational cubes, whatever.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? It's just there for the eye to sort of flicker at, like the wispy single strand camel hair of some frivolous artist. It makes our eyeballs frivolous artists. And so the soul doesn't even want to participate because there's nothing to participate in. So as the eyes become frivolous artists, drifting off, the soul atrophies and you feel it over time. But here's the kicker. You don't have a name for what you're feeling because your soul is so disconnected from the habit of your eye. And you know what we therefore need? Therapy.
Right. Brilliant. There was a lot there that was fine. I'm thinking, eye candy versus soul training. This kind of there's a trailing off, but not a training, and the taking in is the soul training. So there's a few things. So first off, it seems like you have the paintings that don't want to invite you in. They're so abstract and status that they don't care to invite you in. They want to be looked at, pornographic. Then you have the art that is so realistic that it's not training anything. You're outsourcing your capacity to it. The great art does this middle, I guess, this bifurcate, this ability to go, I want to show you enough to show you there's more. That's up to you. Like there's this kind of, and there's that invitation that is a training that great works do. Now, I think you also said something very important on metaphysics becomes interesting again when you're interested in this taking in. I could not agree more. The phenomenology of the artist, the metaphysics of the lack as a present absence, the apophatic. This is very, very important. And I think the question, to go back to the garden example and what you brought up with Saint Maximus, that's very important on this motion. So there's this question, okay, when you walk into a garden and let's say you see the tomato, because we grow a lot of tomatoes, and you see one that looks really beautiful that the squirrels have not eaten, does it stand out to you because of your subjective taste, or does it stand out because it's giving itself to you? Is the thing coming to you, or you pulling it to you, right? Now, of course, you can say both, but there's a way in which, in the great art, there's a moment where you go, well, no, it has to be coming more to me than me going to it because I don't have the capacity to go to it. But it comes to me in a way that teaches me to go toward it. But it's really quick. This is why I think it's a tricky issue. It's a quick thing. Like it grabs your hand and pulls you, and then you're running. And it's like, oh, it's me, because I'm running after it. Well, it took your hand first, though. Don't forget that. But it's really quick, right? So there's a question of, does creation come to you or you pull it to you, right? Now, perhaps as one ascends in the soul or one works towards sanctification, there's something of which you learn how to pull things toward you without disturbing the creative order. Like you're able to go through a forest and keep it still, right? But that seems to be spiritual capacity. It does not seem to be natural to be able to pull things towards you without pulling them out of the music, right? So you almost have to start like a toddler pulling, items out of the cabinets because you don't know any better, and you're just putting them everywhere. You don't have any sense of the art. But as you get older and you learn to read a room, you actually can say, well, I know when it looks right. I know when the room is presenting itself in a manner that is pulling me toward a certain beauty or a sense of serenity. And then perhaps a spiritual discipline is when you say, well, actually, if I take that cup out of the cabinet that looks like I'm making a mess, no, actually putting this cup on the table makes the room even more beautiful. Well, that's weird. It would look like you're making a mess. No, there's something about the object going here that actually makes it feel more homely. When before it was too sterile. It was almost too clean, actually, in a way, right? So there's some sort of way to learn how to participate in enhancing the way that the room gives itself over to anyone who, and I almost want to associate that with stewardship. There's learning capacities of stewardship, Adam in the garden stewardship, and different things like this, right? I think this question, though, of the movement of creation, one of the reasons why the rap example is interesting on the single beat, and you can develop a whole song, because what that case study shows is that even if you just start with the smallest possible beat, if you have the right condition, it can unfold into an entire song. That almost suggests that in everything in creation, there's a wanting to come forth. There is a capacity to come forth into order, to come into the color red, into the shape of the circle, into the stem tomato. Like it comes into from the point so that it's coming at you, right? And if we can learn that, I think the rap study is important, because then that almost gives credence to the case that things are coming toward you, not just you having a preference for it versus something else, right? And that's important because if things are in a way coming toward you, because every note of creation has a music that can come forth. Well, if everything is coming toward you, then there's a capacity to learn. It can be invitational, like that painting, right? Because it has a vanishing point. There's a thing. It's like when you go into the garden and you see the tomato, it's as if you've now been drawn into that circle. Like you're suddenly find yourself in the compass. I'm in the range. I'm in the romance of this tomato and the vanishing point. And so there's a vanishing, but there's a sense of, wow, I'm being pulled toward this thing. So there has to be some point that made the geometry of this circle possible, and it's gone. It's gone. But in its goneness, it feels like a capacity can be gained to pursue it. Not it's gone because it's unknowable, because it's too abstract or silly. No, it feels more like it moved towards you to suggest that there's a taking in, and that in that taking in, there's a vanishing point that made that taking in possible. And you take that in with the taking in of the tomato. You take in the reality of the vanishing point in the taking in of the tomato that made it move towards you because of the taking in. So there's this double apprehension that seems to occur. And I guess I think today, like you said, everyone says, well, it's emotion, it's sensation, it's just what you like. That's why it occurs. Well, that, I would say, strong evidence against merely reducing it to taste is the fact of the rap beat. That in a single thing seems to be an entire unfolding if you have the right way of apprehending it, the right way of approaching it. And then, I mean, to be, Manderbelt, Wolfman, Autonomon, I've been very taken by Stuart Kaufman. I've been very taken by Terence Deacon. And a lot of these people basically say that the universe naturally entails constraints that make negentropy. That things in like the universe in there being limits, like limits to where this pen is, the possibility of a pen comes forth. Because there are limitations, because there's a limit. This pen is limited from being this table, it thus can have a particularity and can come forth as a pen, right? But where is the limit? Where is the constraint? Locate the constraint of the pen. You don't see it, right? And yet the constraint is what makes it come forth as a thing, right? And so the universe in entailing constraints in that makes things come into order. They come into you, not merely you, oh, that's nice, oh, that's nice, oh, that's nice. And so that in of itself suggests that there is a kind of movement that is not merely taste. It is not merely like that's what you're taught about art, right? Like, oh, you like this art, not that art. You like this, you like that. The great art, you can't do. It's like, no, you're here to learn. There's a tutoring of the soul that occurs. You have that sense, and I would defend that with the metaphysics of reality, in fact, ordering from constraint. In fact, entailing a certain ordering that comes forth precisely in its limitation. That comes forth to you, that then that limitation is the vanishing point that you apprehend in taking in, and in taking that in, it kind of woos you to gain your capacity for taking in so you can take in more things that attest to that vanishing point, that ever woos you. But then what's interesting, I am thinking, and then I'll give it to you, I am thanking Jacob and Esau here too, because I was really taken, the story of Jacob is so interesting because there's like that kind of deceit and there seems to be lying and all these kind of different things. If Jacob somehow represents the civilizing process, and a lot of sociologists will talk about that, and Esau is the wild man in the wilderness, there's some sort of violence to civilization. There's some sort of, like smooth versus hairy. You don't get smooth is like civilization, and you have to get razor. It's not easy to get smooth skin, right? So there's some sort of violence to civilization there's some sort of violence to civilization, not necessarily a bad violence. Whereas, we tend to associate Esau with violence and wilderness and anger, but actually there's a kind of violence to civilization. And it's interesting because Jacob and Esau are not a melodrama. It's not Jacob good, Esau bad. That's bad literature. There's this interesting trade-off of competing tensions and different things. And it's as if God is using and blessing the civilizing factor, the civilizing process, that entails a kind of violence, a kind of like interesting deception. And it's almost, to really jump ahead, it's almost that the civilizing factor has to end up in the sacrifice of Jesus, or it maintains this deceptive quality. It maintains this, like the violence has to eventually be a giving over and dying to self, or it becomes power games, right? And so likewise, I'm thinking about, there is a kind of, in the act of apprehension, a kind of violence. There's a kind of pulling the tomato out from the garden and the nature. There's a civilizing of the tomato, which then the problem is how do we move to stewardship then? How do we violently take the tomato out from the garden and yet in that act enhance the garden? How do we have civilization and in fact enhance the world versus just cut man off from nature and the wilderness? And actually, how do we do that? It seems to have something to do ultimately with a kind of sacrifice, like the violence of the sacrifice, because there's also something about a tomato sacrificing itself when it gives itself over to you in a certain way. So those are some thoughts. I'm thinking about civilization as a kind of violence that ultimately has to lead to a logic of sacrifice, or we're in huge trouble. And I know Peugeot will talk about sacrifice and things, giving themselves over. And I think it's like kingdom. He talks about how the human way of understanding reality is kind of a kingdom logic. Well, that's a Rookmacher. Fact equals reality is fact plus meaning. But there's something about, like painting, let's put it this way. Paintings seem to require civilization. You could not have paintings without civilization. And yet civilization tends to have a certain violence of, okay, you're pulled out of the wilderness, you have to go to work, you have to deal with money, you have to deal with certain responsibilities. There's a certain violence to this. And yet, if that violence ultimately is in service of the possibility of that painting that pulls you toward soul development versus eye candying, then that violence seems to be leading to a cross versus the violence leading to eye candy. And then it's like, well, then you'd be better off as freaking Esau, right? Like you'd be better off, maybe you'd be better off as the wild man, right? But if the civilization is leading to the training of the soul in the way you were describing with Maximus, well, that's how it is supposed to be. Otherwise, there's some sort of deficiency that is occurring. You're using the civilizing practice for an eye candy versus the development. And then the last thing I'll say is then I think it's like, oh, you want to do the civilizing? Well, you're going to have to wrestle with God then. Oh, like that's interesting, right? Like Jacob has to wrestle with God. It's like, well, yeah, that's the price. Like if you have a civilizing violence, yeah, there's a certain violence, but it can still be blessed. It can seem to have questionable means, but ultimately that means you wrestle with God. There's a kind of wrestling with God that is the price for that. Well, likewise, when you look at a great painting and it's the ascents of the soul, that is a kind of wrestling with God. Like you're wrestling with God in a certain way because it's demanding of your capacities to ascend. Those are some thoughts that come to mind. I will throw it back to you, Mr. Allison.
The binary as a logical form conceals concealment. What I mean by that is it is a representational form of what some religious practices do, but it's, as it were, sublimated, taken up into the conceptual realm, and so spoken propositionally. Let me give an example. Walk into a room and flip the switch. You go from binary A to binary B. Binary A is the room is dark. You flip the switch. Now you're in binary B. The room is full of light. It is the same room that over encircles the togetherness of darkness, which has a lot of things going on in it, a lot of apprehensions. And then it distinguishes, but still constrains and contains as the wider room, as the wider circle of togetherness, that same room if it was full of light. And the difference between those two circles, those two states, is the flip of a switch. Now, the flip of a switch conceals what's in the wall. And what's in the wall is a series of circuits and cords that also are behind wood, plywood. So it's hiddenness, and it doesn't show itself even in the cords. If you were to rip open the wall and see the cords, you would not see the light coming to be. You would see another layer of hiddenness. So what the invention of modern appliances and infrastructure succeeds in doing is hiding from us the kinesis of so much being. In the same way that certain religious practices will conceal the kinesis of being behind veils. Post-Enlightenment infrastructure treats as holy electricity because it hides it behind the veil. I mean, the plywood. And sure, someone can say, no, it's for engineering reasons. The priests have their reasons for the layout too. You can call it engineering, and it is engineering, but what is engineering but applied calculus, which is applied how to shave off the corners of those really skinny rectangles to make a volume underneath a curve that infinitesimally we can't make sense of. In other words, what do we do with mystery, things we cannot explain? What we do is we hide them between other small things that become ever smaller until it finally goes away. And what we're left with is the mystery of how it all works.
Yeah.
That's what engineering is. When we take in a bridge, we say, wow, that thing is flat. But there's so much going on in a bridge, the stresses, the dynamics, the statics. But all of that is hidden from our eyes.
Mm-hmm.
Strategically hidden by engineering. Why? Because those static and dynamic forces are taken beforehand as holy and as such are treated with great dignity, i.e., are made invisible, are hidden, are put away,
Mm-hmm.
are sanctified.
Mm-hmm.
It's an odd way to look at the flip of a switch to turn the light bulb on. But think about it. So much is hidden because it's so important.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you can't let that thing be exposed. Something could go wrong.
Yeah.
That fire could catch those people with the strange fire and they could die. That's exactly what we have in Exodus, right? The strange fire. I
Yeah.
forgot their names. I'm not saying it's a one-to-one, but I'm saying look around this supposedly secular age,
Yeah.
and we find so many religious practices looming in infrastructure and yet written off as, well, that's sound engineering. Okay.
Yeah.
Versus, my last thing, versus, which is the same thing, illumination. Imagine walking into a room, flipping the switch, versus going outside and building a fire.
Yeah.
Now, the one puts front and center the kinesis of the being. Crackle, crackle, turning white. Oh, I've got to tend it. I've got to attend here and keep it going, or it will go out. Versus, I flipped the switch. That's all I had to do. So much keeping and attending was compressed. And now the keeping and the doing is happening off stage, out of my phenomenological care. It's no longer my concern. It belongs to the utility company. All that keeping and attending. I just pay them. I give them a piece of my tithe, which is what it is. You know, everything's a tithe. All our bills are forms of tithing, right? Oh, I owe it. I owe it. What do you owe them for? Well, they keep the lights on. Yeah, like the priest kept the sacrifice. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
call it what we will. It's
Hmm.
the same thing in the secular age. It's just so hidden from us.
Hmm.
Now, a person could go crazy thinking this way, probably too much, right? I don't think it should drive a person crazy so long as they see that all these interdependencies
Yeah.
mean that the human being fundamentally is religious.
Mm-hmm.
Let it hang out. The wires in the walls speak of religion, my friend. Versus building a fire where that kinesis and being is front and center. I'm not saying it's better than, but at least it feels, because we're so close to that kinesis, we're not just getting the being of light, we're getting the kinesis of light too when we tend the fire. And I think that's part of the reason why when people sit around a fire, they feel lifted. They
Yeah.
feel, oh, this is special. This is a time here. Who's going to tell a story?
Yeah.
We need to sanctify this time that
Yes.
already is sanctified. This is memorable. What do we do around a fire? We just are. We're just together. We're just being. It feels so nice to be together. The togetherness that we are tending that makes the parts of this thing we call fire is inspiring us in our own parts of togetherness to exemplify that more and more and not have it hidden and hidden. What do you do with a house that's full of appliances and wires that are hidden? Go to my own room and shut the door, right? We learn from our architecture what to do and what is not to be done.
Magnificent. So there's a few things. What you were saying about the religion, and we're all religious. Um, if indeed there is some sort of logic that can be found in every iota of creation, like that as an automaton in a a Mandelbrot, a Deacon, a Kaufman, auto catalyst structure that's going on, where things become their own catalyst of transformation, then we should expect there to be sort of isomorphic repetitions in all areas, from religion to secularism, that it actually will be very similar. It will be the same structure, but maybe this is what I would say. The differences are on the edges. Let me explain what I mean by that. Alex Ebert in his freak theory, which I'm a fan of, that I think fits into this, basically says that a lot of what and it goes to the situational reasoning, is the difference between the internal and the external. Like, if there's an internal, there's an external. And following Deacon and all these other people is that the very limit between the internal and the external is the creative dimension. It creates the internal and the external. It's not that the internal and the external are the essential and the limit is the accidental. There's actually something about the limit, the constraint, the lack, that is the essential, that then creates the order of the external and the internal, which is very odd. But then that would sound like a form or an apathetic or a thing not being here that actually makes what is, right? And this goes all the way back to the one of, we could talk about Plotinus or the good, like a thing, or, what does Lewis say about the sun? God is through which I see everything. So of course I can't see God, because he is that from whom everything is seen through, right? Well, there's a way in which all of these notions of constraint and lack, or however we want to word it, is basically saying that there is that of which you cannot experience because it affords the possibility of experience. And if things are being experienced, there is a constraint, a limit, a border, a boundary condition that then in of itself is creative, right? The limit is creative, right? Which in a theological sense would be like the very division between man and God, finite and infinite, is the creativity. The division is the creativity, which of course the division is also a what? A relation. This is what's so odd. Every relation is simultaneously a division, a distinction, that also is against the distinction. Isn't it? It's the weirdest thing in the world. A relation is that which is, like we talked about last time, it's a testament to distinction while simultaneously suggesting the distinction doesn't have the last word, right? That there's an ever deepening that is possible because of the distinction. Well, this sounds like lack, creating necentropy, constraint, what all these people are saying. And basically the best painting and the best art, in making you aware of the taking in, make the mystery of the taking in a process, which suggests there's something there that's not there, that's making the taking in possible. And now you're moving toward this stuff on constraint and limit and so on and so forth, right? Religions. So a few more. First, there's a way in which you were talking the binary, like we get light on, line off, right? So in Hegel, he'll talk about the movement from understanding to reason. Understanding is basically binary and dialectic, where reason is asking, why is everything binary? Oh, wow. Like now you're actually beyond the binary, because you're asking about what reality must be possible for everything to seem like an either or, right? So a way maybe I could think about that with the compass example is there's a circle and you spend your whole life asking what's in the circle versus what's out the circle. So you're binary. The vertical move is when you go, there must have been like something to draw this circle that's vanished, the vanishing point. And now you've moved from algebra to geometry. Now you've moved from purely horizontal to vertical, right? There's something that made this binary possible that is only possible because of something invisible. Likewise, the wires in the wall. Something invisible made it possible to say light on, light off. There's a whole lot of complexity that is invisible that makes it possible to even think the binary off on, right? So likewise, if you go this circle that everything fits in works really, really well, this binary seems to really work for describing the quality of the room. What makes it possible? What makes this binary work? This is something Hegel would stress. He's like, the problem is dialectical thinking, because he was adamant that he wasn't just a dialectical thinker. He was a speculative reasoning. He wanted to move to speculative cognition, which is basically the movement to asking about the thing that is not there, right? It's like, he's like, we can spend our entire life stuck in the dialectic, versus asking, what are the conditions of reality necessary to make a dialectic possible, right? What makes it possible for the light to be on or off? Well, the invisible wires, right? So that's the speculative reason where you move to the invisible. It's like, wow, this circle is perfect. Must have been a steady point to make that possible that is vanished and not here. What might that be? And for him, funny enough, and I think Leibniz is the same, philosophy started at that point. Philosophy wasn't the dialect, philosophy was not the dialectical reasoning. No, philosophy was the realization that dialectics are only possible because something must be the case that isn't present in the dialectic. And of course, then it borders, well, then, of course, I mean, the line between Hegel moves into a somewhat mystical direction, certainly, because you kind of have to. But he didn't, but he, of course, would have, I think he would have been a bit disturbed by the hard break between theology and philosophy and metaphysics and science and all of that, because, of course, for him, it's all a movement of thought, right? But anyway, if you go, oh, there must have been a vanishing point. Well, now we've moved to situation from algebra. We've talked about that with Leibniz. The other thing is you've moved to asking about mystery versus, so there's a few you could have there's a few ditches. There's the ditch of stuck in binary forever. Then there's the ditch of confusing mystery with technical complexity. The electrical boards go, oh, and you spend your whole life learning technical complexity thinking that's mystery. And then, of course, there's the ditch of meta versus mystery, right? Where you can be like always self-aware of your self-awareness of the dialectic, where you're making yourself the object of your analysis versus the entire situation as a mystery, right? So there are ditches one has to avoid. All right, how do we stay focused on the mystery? Okay, in this way, because to me, I'm associating mystery with the training of the soul, which is tied to the taking in, and we've got to resist all temptations to trail off from the mystery, right? What's interesting is, again, I alluded to it, there seems to be an interesting kind of violence of civilization necessary to create spaces of mystery. Not by chance, probably the temple has sacrifice. There's some sort of long history of sacrifice and mystery and ritual all going together. There's a deep, mystery there. Anyway, though, so there's an idea, it's like, you're focusing on the mystery, not the complexity, not the meta. So here's the question. How do you keep your eye on the mystery per se? Like, how do you keep yourself trained by the mystery versus fall in a ditch, right? So at the beginning of what I was saying, I think it's something to do with the boundary, the character of the boundary between the internal and the external, the man and God, like the limit condition, because the limit, the constraint, the border seems to be what creates the negentropy, which is the opposite of entropy. Negentropy is the opposite of entropy. And it creates the order, creates the music, right? And the weird revelation of rap is that every iota of creation it must contain the possibility of music. That's almost its constraint. That's kind of God's like constraint of creation is that you must always be possibly creative. Every point must have a creative possibility. The constraint is you must have a creative possibility, which is interesting. Like the constraint is the necessity of this. Well, this is Hegel. The constraint, the limit is that the limit must always move. It must always have a capacity of moving, right? It must always have a potential of being alive. Everything must have, if rightly ordered by the human relation, a creative possibility. That is the constraint. And the mystery, of course, is how is that? What is the way to tap into that? How to relate to that? And how to get better at that, right? But anyway, the revelation, so a lot of it seems to be the quality of the constraint. And the revelation of religions was you do that really well, not by a wall, but a veil. Okay? Not an open field, which may be the wilderness, but a veil. A veil is very, very specific. I know we had that, we call it like, because a veil is not so hard that you can't see beyond it, but it's also not translucent that you know what's on the other side of it. It's a very particular quality that it has, very artful to make a veil. Another example I think about often is a shadow. A shadow, and I'm thinking of In Praise of Shadows, the Japanese philosopher, there's a number of Japanese, Daniel Zaruba is very good on that. But a shadow, for a lot of the Japanese, they really didn't like American architecture because they didn't use shadows artistically. It was either all just hot illumination or the light was off. Shadows make a room more elegant. But a shadow is a very particular thing. It has to have an object in the right position of the light to create the shadow, right? So there's a radical particularity. Another example that I think has come up before with Owen Barfield, and I was speaking with Segal, is the rainbow from Owen Barfield. A rainbow requires very particular conditions, rain, sunlight, standing in the right place, and then you see it. But it's not a hallucination because anyone under those conditions could see it as well. And then there's a rainbow, right? So the example for me, when you go out and make a fire versus just turn on the switch, and like you said, there's something about the fire that feels like, wow, it's getting serious. There's something about the fire that is more like a shadow in a veil than it is a wall. And good paintings are more like veils than they are walls or open fields. Veils seem to require civilization, but civilization only works if there's sacrifice. So, I keep alluding to that. There's something there that I kept thinking about reading, Esau and Jacob. It's just, but anyway, but the veil is the movement, because the veil moves you, right? Like a veil, like you want to know what's on the other side of it, but you also don't want, well, the other thing too about a veil is there's also a sense in which you kind of don't want to move the veil because then the movement ends. Like you want it, like a veil keeps the movement alive too. Like it's kind of healthy to not want to tear the veil down. Like it's kind of like a sign of a good soul, like a healthy soul enjoys the movement. Like it delights in the movement because the only way to be moving toward God is movement, right? Like it's like there's a certain delighting in the feeling of movement itself, because then it feels like you're participating in creation, right? But of course, the problem with a human veil, if you intentionally say like the J.J. Abrams, I'm never going to open this box, well, that doesn't seem right either, because then you're turning it into an idol. Like there's something like you're arbitrarily making it function as a veil versus learning how to see everything as veils in their givenness, right? That seems to be the movement of a healthy soul. Is not where you're like, oh, I'm just going to never open this box and have a black box so that I'm always interested, because then that's arbitrary. No, I'm going to learn how to see everything in this right condition. So then what's interesting there is what we've done in the modern world is, yeah, we have a wall that hides the wiring, but we're not gaining the capacity because we don't think about it, right? This seems to be the problem. Is like, well, Ivan Illich says you're disabled now. We're all disabled because we don't think about how the light's on or off. We don't think about it, right? There's something about making a fire that feels like I have a skill. I'm enabled. I'm human. I'm freaking human. Oh my gosh, I forgot. These are hands. I can do this. Like there's an enabling that occurs, right? Like a fire feels enabling, where the modern world can be disabling. And then, of course, if there's something about the training of the soul, that always seems like it has to be on the side of enablement. So there's something analogous with the making of fire that feels enabling. But likewise, the veil feels enabling because you feel, oh, my soul feels like it's moving again. Likewise, great paintings feel like they're enabling the soul because they're moving you into the capacity, right? So there's something about veil. The key is religion. The great painters, and I'll give it to you, great painters, great religions, like the great priests were aware that the name of the game was the quality of the boundary. The quality of the boundary, not just the question of in or out, like what's in and what's out. They're like, well, that will kind of take care of itself if we get the quality of the boundary right. Right? So likewise, I guess that goes back to the taking in versus just the taken in, because you're learning how to have the right boundary between you and the tomato, so you never lose sight of the process of taking in itself, because if you do that, you move to entropy versus negentropy. Like that's kind of the issue. If you want to have a system that is creative and negentropic versus entropic, it's all about the quality of that boundary condition. And the boundary condition, well, kind of music is a boundary, right? It feels like it's in this world and the outer world at the same time. So it's all about the quality of the music. And it is interesting to think that art is always a kind of boundary because it does feel that way, right? Like a great painting feels like a boundary between obviously the intention of the artist and yourself or what the art, but also it feels like between worlds. There's a between worldness to great art, right? Well, that's a quality boundary. Like, I guess what I'm getting at there is we often think about boundaries or limits as lines or, like things that demarcate a line. But it's funny because actually, if we think geometrically and multidimensionally, a painting is a boundary. A boundary can look like a painting following a higher geometry, right? Music is a kind of boundary, but it's a boundary that makes possible an order, that makes possible a movement of the spirit. And again, the problem with modern life, well, it's kind of like these bad paintings because you know that there's a complexity to the lights turning on and off, but it's not invitational. It doesn't feel like you're invited. Like, actually, you should call an expert. If you think you can know how the lights work without an expert, you're arrogant. It's not invitational at all, right? Like, but a fire is interesting because you don't feel like, does anyone say, let's call an expert to build a fire? I have never on bonfire night gone, hey, kids, I know we want to make a fire, but we got to call an expert. Never does anyone call the bonfire expert to come in, right? But when it comes to fixing the lights, you call an electrician. You don't even blink, right? So that right there suggests something. Right there suggests a capacity, and it's almost like when you're encountering mystery, you don't even think about calling an expert, right? Like that seems, well, and then I will give it to you. That right there is a problem with art because a lot of art today you feel like you need to call an expert to understand. Not that it invites you into something. Sure, reading about the life of Da Vinci can enhance things, but you don't feel like you need an expert to explain. A lot of art now is like, I need a literary professor to get it, right? By all means, I would hope the literary professor could enhance it. But if you're like, I'm completely lost without the literary professor, there's something wrong. And it's like, that it's not a fire then. It's electrical wires, which is disable me and can't train the soul. But let me give it to you, sir.
Based on what you said, I am convinced that there's nothing special about post-enlightenment now. It's a religious manifestation, or it's another manifestation of
absolutely.
religion.
Yeah.
Because the veil of the 21st, 20th, well, we're in the 21st, so I won't say 21st. The veil of the 20th, 19th, and 18th century was, maybe has been, complexity.
Yeah, absolutely.
The epistemic is the interwoven, artful mystification of what is there and what is going on behind what is here. Therefore, oh, something's wrong. What do we mean something's wrong in the 21st century? There's a revelation. Wow. I'm encountering the divine, encountering a spirit. I'm crossing paths with entities and dimensions. Wow. All right. How is that mediated in the post-enlightenment now? I better call an expert. And you can almost hear the shingles up above where the curtain is being held, being moved. Shh. What's that number again? Shoot, man, I really need him or her. Wow, this is great. We look at it as, that's not a veil, but what is it? It's a mediation, Hegelian term. It's a mediation. A three-dimensional body comes and interposes that body, the plumber, the electrician, interposes another body between you and the problem, which is a kind of holy place in post-enlightenment secular now. We don't have altars, we have electrical wires.
Yeah.
We have toilet seats. We have stuff that can go wrong. Go wrong, we have no idea what it means. It's an anomaly. It's, something broken in my house. My house is going to break down. This is bad. My neighbors are going to see this. And then who knows what's going to happen? It's a flood. And now Peterson, right, could chime in with a chorus of Noah's flood's coming and you're not prepared, right? You're not the righteous man of your generation. I know I'm not. Whoa, this is getting really heady, really Christian, really fast. Wow. I need some secular mediation right now. Okay, let me call the plumber. And the veil goes in front of all this illumination and further calcifies, yeah, this is a problem that is being solved behind closed doors while I can go on my laptop and watch cute cat videos, and that pipe is being whatever back there. The priest is at work atoning for my sins. The sins of this house, the sins of this structure are being atoned for through his handiwork and his knowledge and just the know-how. The stuff I can't explain to you, it's like it's channeling through him or her right now. It's like there's a connection from top down going through that person. And isn't it great they have their own business? They have apprentices and they're kind of, you know, if I ever had a son or daughter, I'd want them to someday be like that or a professor, right? Another kind of mediation. I'm going to open Moby Dick to you. Oh, it's too hard. It hurts too much. Gosh, too much light. I can't bear it. And you know how that's manifested in post-enlightenment 21st century now? That light is expressed. The name given to it, I'm bored. I'm so disabled in front of this book. It's so boring. Gosh, I'm actually having an arrogance towards it. But you know what? I want to be a well-rounded individual. I want to be sanctified. I want to be made holy in this secular world. And so I'm going to learn what America's spirit is. But I can't find it on my own. It's too complex. It's too veiled. And you know what? It's just not the time for me. I'm too young. It's not that season yet in the calendar. So here's an interposition. The professor opens it and then gives you these nuggets, gives you these concepts. And oh, nodding my head, I'm validated as a student. I have my role. He or she has their role as teacher. I'm participating in this ritual of being educated. I feel that I'm learning, and now I can walk away. I'm not going to open that book. I'm not Saint Peter, and I'm not going to jump in the water and swim to Christ. I can't do that. But I have been given the fish through my professor of what was going on here. And what more can you expect from us who are so belated, so after by generations from when Moby Dick was composed? All those things, so many generations after, the professor studied more years, he or she has a way with words, I don't. What I want to argue is all those words are mediations, complexities, mystifications that in a secular way veil the illumination that is the Moby Dick book, the piping under the ground, the electrical wires, all these revelations that are happening now that we've so put in a box behind a veil and called, thinking we're being non-religious, called, that's just the modern age.
I completely agree. I think so. There's a way in which religion is a question of the inner and outer, the finite and the infinite. It's a question of topography, of the situation. It's always a question of the constraint, the boundary, the limit, the line, the distinction. Like, and we as human beings are always religion binding. We are always bound and bound to that question. We are always bound to constraint. And whatever we do is a question of a relation to a constraint, which is then a relation to the creative principle, because constraint creates. All great artists also know that, right? Like, artists know that art is not free flow creativity. It's radically constrained. Like, if you want, like, once you set up the character, like this is the thing. To create, like, fiction shows constraint is creative. Like, once you create Benji in The Sound and the Fury, or Christmas in Absalom on Light in August, there's certain things that Christmas would do and other things he wouldn't. in the creation is constraints for believability. If there's not a fidelity to the constraints, then it is not believable. And there's a way in which the creation is afforded by the constraint. Afforded is a word obviously Viveki will use a lot. You hear that, and I think it's a valid term, because the very moment you create something, there are limits in a story for what is believable of the character or not. And actually, a good author knows that very limitation, suddenly you're surprised where the story goes, and actually the power comes from that, right? Of which is the creative possibility that occurred because you were true to the constraint, right? So the religion, in my opinion, is always dealing with a question of the quality and character of the boundary, the limit. Is God totally other? Or is he incarnate? Is there no God? Is it just us? All of those are boundary questions. If God's totally other, there's a noumenon, a hard noumenon. If there's an incarnate, it's more like a veil. There's a distinction, but it's something that's more like a veil if it's an incarnate. If there's no God, well, the boundary is nothing, but it is about we are the boundary. It's simply our own choice and capacity, right? And if you say that like humans can be God, then their boundary is of their choosing. All of these change your relationship to the boundary. And I'm using limit, boundary, constraint interchangeably, right? Post-Enlightenment, what was the key philosopher that made the world, the modern world, I think you could make a very strong argument, is Kant. And what is Kant's big idea? The noumenon. What is the noumenon? But a quality of the boundary. It is a philosophy of a boundary, right? And the whole world was made by this. Certainly, it haunted philosophy. Now, Hegel, his giant critique of Kant is the noumenon's in the phenomenon. The boundary is in we. That's an idea, in us. The noumenon is an idea. But the idea that we can't get to things in of themselves, that has been the most, I think you could argue, the most influential philosophical concept of the last 300 years. Like, it's been so much so that the man on the street knows what the noumenon is. It's a common idea. All of these is a matter of a belief of the nature of our constraint. That the quality of, so our religion is the noumenon. Your religion is your belief of your constraint. In my opinion, like that's a way. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that's all religion is, but I think at the very basis of a religion is always a question of the quality of the constraint, which then determines the creativity, the negentropy. That in of itself determines what unfolds. Matthew, please.
I just want to compliment you. That was so well put and succinct, what you said about religion and constraint there. Thank you. It nerve fired some synapse that was cobwebbed. And I don't know what it means yet, but thank you for putting it the way you put it. I appreciate it. Please keep going.
Well, thank you, Matthew. Well, because it's always like like questions of God are tied to questions of constraint and boundary. Is he entirely unknown? Is he knowable to some degree? Like these are all boundary questions. And what the metaphysics of post-enlightenment has been noumenon, which means it has been a boundary that is uncrossable, right? It is a wall. Well, then of course you have walls with electronics behind it that we don't think about. We can't know about it. Like technology is what follows from the noumenon, of course. And complexity is what follows. And of course, there's a way in which the noumenon is true, but it moves. This is Hegel's whole idea. It's a living noumenon. Like, yeah, you can't get to the things of themselves because they're in time and they're always alive. There's always a romance. That's the move. Well, Kant was not romantic enough. Sure, there's a noumenon. I can never know Michelle in her entirety, just like Dante can never access Beatrice entirely. That's why the ascent of the soul is possible. The noumenon is precisely what is wooing you. Not game over, man. You're in the friend zone forever. Basically, Kant's noumenon means you're always in the friend zone. That's it, man. But that's not how it's like, oh, no. The noumenon is to woo you into relationship, right? That notion of things in of themselves, like things in of themselves are relations, situations. They are in of themselves love, relative to your relation to it. It's not a friend zone, right? But our belief in that boundary is what then shaped our view of everything that follows, right? And now, of course, the great irony, Kant's whole notion of the noumenon was kind of to save religion, right? I'm gonna I'll have faith over here in the things in themselves, and I'll have reason over here in the phenomenon, and now religion is, God is safe. My noumenon has saved God. And then of course in the critique of and then he tries to make, in my opinion, what he tries to do in the critique of pure reason, we move into the second critique of practical reason, which then we're like, well, then even though I can't justify rationally moral law, there is some connection of practice with the things in of themselves, even if I cannot conceptualize it. And then in the third critique, I think he tried to make judgment and beauty a coming forth of things that are there, even though you can't know they're there. And so there's a way in which beauty suggests that the noumenon, things in of themselves, are not purely unrelated to human affairs, even if we can't think them. Those are the ways I think he tried to not fall into a kind of almost bad Gnosticism or something like that. The problem with that, of course, is that at the end of the day, you don't get mystery. You get luck. Like you get luck. That's all you got. And oh, you got lucky. And there's a way, please.
Luck and sentiment.
Yeah, you get luck
And
and sentiment.
sentiment either because I am lucky and know it, and wow, I want to sit on the edge of a beach and watch the nuclear missiles from that New Hope Star Wars movie come crash. You know that movie I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Not New Hope as in the old one, but I think it's called it was based off those few people who found the map to the
Yes.
part of the Death Star.
Yeah. Rogue Nation.
Rogue
Rogue
One.
One.
The
Yeah.
last
Yeah.
scene
Yeah.
where they're sitting on the beach,
Yeah.
embracing one another, looking over at the nuclear missile coming down. We got the short end of the stick, you and I down here, but we got each other and we have a few seconds left.
Let's hug.
That's you've got bad luck and sentiment. Now, let's say they weren't on the ground, but they were in the ship with the map in hand. We made it. We're going to Princess Leia. We're lucky. Still, though, what do you have more than that piece of paper but sentiment? Yeah, we made it. Kant, with his noumena, took things like prudence, proverbs, and wisdom, and he made them weird because they can't be fully committed to the noumenal. You can't have a Sophia, but you also can't have a purely practical, technical, artful Sophia. It has to be this thing that sort of, I have the hammer and the anvil, and that's what I do. I make little things and I sell them, and I'm not a king, but I have a family, and that's good enough. That's kind of divine too. It's kind of holy. But just don't get me going though. Don't get me going. I'll cry because I'm thinking about my little nephew and it's I have no religion. I don't have time to go to church, but this is kind of my thing. Alone with these sparks, I kind of feel like I'm among angels, man. Everything he says is so beautiful, this fictitious hypothetical character. The only problem is it's said on the strength of sentiment, borrowing from Kant's made-up noumenal realm that straddles the line between the practical art and the truly divine, where it can't be on either side, so it's nowhere at once. But there you are, still in God's creation, using the hammer and anvil and getting sweaty and asking yourself deep down, why don't I make time to go to church? Why do I give all my time to this capitalist pursuit? I have no good reason except this feeling of tremendous awe at the beauty of the sunrise. So I'm a romantic, but I'm not tutored by a ritual because I don't go to church. So I have to interpret these tears somehow. And so thank God for Kant to give me these semi-quasi-humanistic terms so that I can reflect back to myself in a dialectical mode my sentiment. but it's just Protestant enough that I feel like I am a church of one and that I'm chosen, and it's good enough, but I dare not say it out loud because I have no way to defend it. And you know what? Dialectic nth degree here. That's the proof that it's real because I can't defend it. It's so real. I found it. I found it. And I found it exactly where I least expected to find it in myself. Now you're doomed.
Yeah,
You're doomed.
completely doomed. Completely
But it
doomed.
feels like you're saved
Yeah.
for a
Hmm.
split second because from beginning to end, that whole thing was sentiment.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Brilliant. I think that was brilliant. There is something in Kant that leads to a bad Puritanism, a bad kind of Puritan Protestantism that's salvation without sanctification. So there's this movement of God, but no movement of you. God became man for you to find him versus God became man so man could become God. That second part is missing. And that there's no Eros, there's no, Dante and any of that. And yeah, when I read Kant, like in that example, like obviously Kant was an interesting fellow with his walking time, and he wasn't married, but he had apparently great dinner parties. They were fun or something. But he reminds me, as examples, I think about Kant. So Kant's philosophy is a philosophy of the boundary. What is the quality of the boundary? And everything we're talking about, the meta, because what else can you do with a noumenon but be meta? Like, that's all you've got then, is an ever meta. There can't be mystery, just meta, or complexity, or the expert. That's all. The expert is noumenal, of course. They have the knowledge. I don't. There's a noumenal relationship. And then, of course, there's AI taking over noumenon, black box, I can't access, capital of Nick Land, of course. All of this follows, it's a thing noumenon, as he put it, right? Good examples of where Kant leads you is I was just finishing an interesting book on who got Einstein's office, which was about kind of the politics of the Advanced Institute after Einstein died. It was a very interesting book. And also when by Holt, I didn't like it as much, but when Einstein walked with Gödel, but one of the things I bring this up is because Kurt Gödel, is a very sad life, honestly. There's a certain sadness to his life, and he reminds me of Kant. And you have this individual that with Gödel numbers shows that you can't get the axiomatic. You can't get what's called a formal system, which is a mathematical proof that entails its own laws, and the dream of mathematics before Gödel was a formal system. Well, he showed you couldn't do it. But critically, Gödel was a Platonist. Now, I think the bad kind of Platonist, not the right kind of Platonist, but he was a Platonist. So he thought it's very odd. He was like, well, a formal system is impossible, yet math is unreasonably accurate. Therefore, math must be Platonic. This is critical. Gödel was not like, oh, I've shown there's no truth. He's like, I've shown that finitude cannot compute itself. Therefore, there must be a Platonic realm, right? But here's the issue. It is a noumenal Platonic realm. It is one that you're completely cut off from, of course. And what you see in Gödel is so interesting because, for example, he wanted stillness, not music. Like you get to the Platonic by the absence of music, he was a recluse. But the end of his life, I think, also shows you what happens with Kantianism in this way. Bad Kantianism. Maybe there's a sophisticated Kantian. I know Kant at the end of his life apparently wrote a crazy book called Opius or something that was never published. That is weird. That maybe turns everything over. I don't know. There may be Kant scholars who know better, and I know Joel, his teacher, will talk about Kant in different ways. But there is no doubt there has been a popular understanding of Kant that has made the world what it is based on the noumenon. I don't think you can debate that. If you want to say that's the bad interpretation, well, that's always, isn't it funny that the world just keeps being made in the image of the bad interpretation of things, right? Maybe the bad is the true. Anyway, what happens at the end of Gödel's life is that he starves himself to death because he thinks his food is all poisoned. Like he's paranoid. That was alluded to in the Oppenheimer movie when he won't eat it. Einstein said, well, yeah, that's what happened. And when his wife, critically, his wife went to the hospital, Anna, I think it was, and then he was doomed because he had to fend for himself. Well, Anna could convince him that his food wasn't poisoned, apparently, but when he was by himself, he couldn't convince himself, and so he was done. But isn't that interesting? Because that means to escape paranoia and self-enclosure, you need a what? Relationship. And so that right there is a testament to how the noumenon gets you in trouble, is because the noumenon locks you in a self-enclosure where paranoia takes over, right? Or the unknown. You can't know. Please.
And let's take Gödel and his wife and the broccoli. We'll call it broccoli. Each broccoli. When he looked at the broccoli, it was a light he could not bear. I will say hypothetically. Now, the way in which he expressed or manifested his being unable to bear it was, that will kill me. Can't look God in the face and live. What kills you? Poison kills you. This will kill me. Poison kills you. Therefore, this is poison. I don't know what poison is, just like I don't know what a predator is. But I can tell you what poisons do, and I can tell you what a predator wants to do. And right now, this broccoli, if I put it in my mouth, will act as if it is poison. So why don't I put together what already is together and call that togetherness by the name poison? You call it broccoli. I seem, or want to say that I seem to be, calling it closer to its parts. Hypothetically, that's how he was responding to this light. Some fathers will say the same light is in heaven and hell, except in heaven it's light, it's bright, and in hell it burns. That broccoli was burning. It wasn't this beacon of nutrition, beaming with strength or potential strength. How does he religiously participate in the revelation of broccoli? The way he is constrained religiously to participate in the event of broccoli before him, the encounter with broccoli before him, the encounter of this boundary before him, is to hide and protect himself. Go in the bushes. We heard the sound of you. This is burning. I'm ashamed. These are all responses to, if we evacuate these words of their semantic connotations, I'm ashamed. We heard the sound of you. We were afraid. We hid ourselves. This thing is poison. All those things are, to use a word you used earlier, avoidances. All right. Now, some people might emphasize that, well, we avoid because of shame, and we become psychologists. Or they emphasize we avoid because of this inexplicable something that is broken. Maybe they end up being biologists and study ways that I have too much sodium in my body. I don't know what they would find in that forest. Or they come up with they generate some other explanation that in that genesis gets them moving with speculation. And they could devote their whole life to that complexity, that mediation of the post-enlightenment trailing off of the intellect, of the soul. Because we don't go on pilgrimages anymore. We go on sabbaticals. You see what I'm saying? It's just a joke, but we go on mental hiatuses instead of these pilgrimages. Well, that's what the noumena teaches us. It should be done. All right. But he had an interposition. He had someone priest-like come between him and this burning broccoli. And this person was manifested as the role of his wife. And with this understanding between them, the binary was overcome.
Yep. Yep.
And the dialectic even was transcended. And he was able to participate in the broccoli, i.e., eat it, insofar as that particular being could be participated in. You can't participate in broccoli the way you would participate in a Rolls Royce, but you can participate in insofar as it is broccoli by eating it. I can't eat a Rolls Royce. There's a real difference that makes a difference between them. But I couldn't participate in the broccoli as broccoli before there was an understanding between my wife and I. That to me is astounding. I find that to be archetypal or certainly religious. We don't even have to use the word archetypal. I think it's much deeper than that. What do you make of these things? And someone could say now, wow, well, I guess broccoli just is information, and relationships are social information, and maybe social information is higher than organic information. So the social information sublimated, that is, took up the organic information and allowed that organic information to be this higher than dialectic, not tit for tat, win loser participation in the harmony of the family, which is a higher mode of being that gets us eventually to the Hegelian state or a city, right? Because hopefully everybody in the family eats broccoli, not just the husband and the wife. So now broccoli's starting to go on tour. It's starting to become a staple diet in the human being across families. All because the original man and woman had an understanding. So I could definitely see how the modern secularist would have no problem with that myth you just put forward of this brilliant mathematician goes haywire, becomes a Platonist, but what keeps him tethered to the world, what keeps him real and not Gnostically floating off like a let go of balloon, is the religion of Christianity. Which, though, if you're Kantian in your Christianity, you're not going to be able to get except through this highly mediated, complex secularism that usually consists in an understanding of between two people. Most fitly expressed in a family. Now, Christianity has always harbored families, but it also harbored the monks and the anchorites. So I think in a way, when we let go of Kant and secularism, we still move with the family, but we transcend not only the binary and the dialectic, because Kant's noumena did that too, but we transcend that buffer space that Kant put there between the dialectic and the mystical. We can bring the family into the mystical. We can bring the single individuals into the mystical. But if you've got a numinous, the noumenon between the mystical and the dialectic, you'll have the family stop short, or you'll have the single individual stop short. What do you think of those points?
I think you said that a lot that was very good, and it should be, so there's a few things. First, if Gödel needed the relation to survive, then one should think that the relation is, why would we think relations are not real? Like the relation is what keeps the order going, right? Like the relation is what avoids the entropy. It is so there's a way and also please note the tragedy is that Gödel did starve himself to death because when you're stuck on a noumenon religion, if you will, then you don't understand the primacy of the relation. Therefore, you do not make sure you have it, or if it's gone, you're then lost, right? Or if like a circumstances arises, right? So I think that was also very good because that I think does speak to this. I guess what I've been thinking about is there's a civilizational violence that the moment there's a civilization, there's a wilderness and there's a civilization. There's a violence, right? And what is Gödel's wife doing? She is sacrificing herself. She is having a sacrificial role. When you have civilization without sacrifice, it becomes noumenal. It becomes noumenal. The wilderness then is wild and stupid and the uncivilized and beyond us, and we don't need to access it, right? It doesn't teach us anything. What do we see in Jacob and Esau? They hug at the end. There's an embrace that comes together, right? And you have this kind of idea that also Jesus goes into the wilderness, he sends his people out. It isn't this like outer inner bad, but a constant work of the boundary condition and being a veil, being where God is incarnate, so that in any condition you can access and attune yourself to that mystery. And if you don't have that kind of metaphysics, then you're ultimately going to probably fall into a noumenon of some kind. We're enlightened, they're not. Civilization, wilderness. There has to be a sacrifice or there's going to be a noumenon. It seems as if everyone is religious because everyone has a relationship to boundaries. There's some sort of boundary, some sort of constraint, and everyone has a belief of the quality of that boundary. Like, what is its character? So every human being relates with boundary. In being human, you are bound to boundaries. Binded, right? You have to be, okay? Because you're bounded. Every human has a metaphysic of what they think is the nature of boundaries, right? And so everyone is bound to religion in this sense because everyone has to make a decision on the qualities of boundaries, of which then, following out all the Deacon and all these other people, Ebert, etc., your belief in the quality of your boundaries determines what's created. Like it determines what follows. It seems as if post-enlightenment society is a religion, still a religion, that doesn't have sacrifice. Maybe it has service, but it's the technocrat service. And then service without sacrifice becomes elite class that rules everyone. So it's almost like this. You get a civilization without sacrifice, then it gets a noumenon, which then in getting a noumenon, the sacrifice, it becomes the people serving then becomes the expert class. And it becomes a rulership or something. Please.
I don't think human beings can escape sacrifice. So even if it is downgraded or downtrodden to a service, it still requires a sacrifice.
Sure.
For example, the technocrats in their technocrating will eventually feel so much guilt at what they've done to the masses of people underneath them, the wasteful use of human labor, the identification of human beings with numbers in a portfolio, and that they'll try to make amends. Now that amends is very wishy-washy because it's showing its hand.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not going to find all these people who lost their jobs because of me. So what do? I leave a legacy for my grandchildren. Or, you know what? I must be worth $1 billion for some reason because I have $1 billion. There's no way around it. There must be some reason for me to have this because I have it. So I'm the optimal person to be standing here because I have it now. I need to put a rocket in space because this planet's in danger. And I need to give myself up for something higher, which in a weird way is something lower. I need to give myself up for the earth, which this whole time has been beneath my feet.
Mm.
See how groveling it is? It's sacrifice. It's a form of prostration. We need to save the planet. The planet's been under your feet the whole time. You've always been master over it. Why are you now acting like you have to serve it? Because it's a groveling position. Because you want to serve something and you feel like you can't serve anything. It's at the level of being disabled with respect to worship. And even if there weren't evil spirits influencing people and misdirecting people and deluding people, then the guilt and unknowing alone, what does God say? What does one of the prophets say somewhere? My people die for lack of knowledge. Just the lack of knowing how to worship God can drive us into a groveling posture before some blueberries. They finally came out. Oh, the torment of man over the earth. And finally, I was able to cut through it and do all these things. And there's this pure, pristine, it's a blueberry. But they can't see it as a blueberry because of these games we play. If we don't really have a church, we play church, which means that the veil always is changing. And that's exhausting. And then we give up for a time and become agnostic until we're so depleted that we feel ourselves as prodigal again. But we have to take our time in coming back so that we come back to the Father's house and not get stuck along the way at an inn or behind some other veil and think, oh, I've got my fix. Well, it might not be a fix. It might be a little mechanical thing they put against your arm that, man, this is bionic. Yeah. Especially with AI around the corner. I think there's going to be the proliferation of noumena.
Yeah,
There will
absolutely.
be a proliferation of buffered spaces where it's not dialectical. So I think most people can step beyond the binary. Good, bad. Nah, man, I let go of that when I stopped watching cowboy movies. Where they wore the black hat and the white hat. I'm beyond binaries, man. But they're perfectly content being in dialectics the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
Reflecting on their own reflections and then upon themselves as agents that can reflect as they act. And then they involve other people in their experiments as they're acting with them and noticing they're acting upon them. And it's just kind of like a tug of war game with everybody and everything. And then they become like moralists about what they're doing and it's wrong. And then they reflect upon that. And then they try to teach people, don't make the same mistake I made. And then they have, like a decade out of that, kind of a guru thing. But all that's dialectics, because what's going to happen after 10 years? You become disenfranchised with your own speech. And now you need to find someone to give you a speech to help you out of the funk that you created with your own speeches. So it's always dialectical until the body's exhausted and the mind stops. I think that's harder to get out of. But maybe with the internet and all these rapid AI, ChatGPT collecting things for us and putting it in front of a search engine, all these little mini bonfires of putting together things that fall apart. The more rapidly we see that more often, may push us to the edge, to the moving limit of dialectic.
Yeah.
The problem, though, is because it's so of the air in our culture and has been for a number of generations, what will often meet us at that limit, the moving limit, is the noumena. And the noumena will want to keep us at an arm's length from the mystical.
Yes.
So our culture through AI will allow us to come to the edge of dialectics. That's a deep fake of a deep fake of a deep fake from a meme that was half baked, man, at the beginning of the internet. Like we'll be able to say all this nonsense, but it all holds together for 10 minutes. Like we'll be right on the edge of the dialectics, ready to get off of that ship. And it will probably be very horrible to be in that space for so long. But the noumena, and I don't know what form it will take, but it will probably be the same thing it was for people in the 18th century. The man with the anvil and the sparks and the tears and the sentiment. It'll be sentimental. Some kind of upsurge of emotion, this outbreak of feeling, mediated through a sentimental puppy or holding of a baby. The stuff that just seems so precious will become the very totem of whatever beyond dialectics can be, I don't know, negotiated to. It won't be mystical, though. It'll never be mystical. And I think the marker of it never being mystical is it will always remain on an individual basis.
Mhm.
Only individuals can encounter the numinous. And only on an individual basis can they stay in relation, if you want to call it a relation, with the numinous. Which means, in Kierkegaard, this is what the book Fear and Trembling is about at its bottom. The moment you enter into an absolute relation with what is the absolute for you, and this was one of Kierkegaard's ironic books. It wasn't his book as a Christian author. It was his book as De Silentio, Man of Silence. The Christian part of Kierkegaard was saying nothing in that book. He constantly said through a pseudonym, I'm not a Christian. I don't have faith. I admire people with faith. He was still in the dialectical realm.
Mhm.
And faith for him was the numinous. It was just somebody to admire, like you would go and admire a gymnast. That's somebody with a skill that I can appreciate, but I can't take in. So it's not quite dialectical because I'm not telling him that he doesn't have that skill. I'm not abstracting it out of that matter. And knowing that I can't do that and put it inside myself qua thinker, all I can do to sustain a pseudo relationship with that other person who has the skill that I don't have and therefore cannot participate in as co-having is a pseudo relationship of admiration, of fawning. And all Fear and Trembling is fawning over the figure of Abraham with a lot of Greek rhetorical schemes of fawning. Now, that interestingly, though, it never, in all that sequencing of complex Greek rhetorical schemes for fawning, the panegyric, the 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 attunement, all these chapters of his, the problemata, where you say the problem and you beautify it, you talk it up without a solution. All these distances from, they are voluminous and they make a big book, but even at the end, he says, I have not stepped one step closer to faith. It's all been mediation. It's all been complex. It's all been the plumber over my shoulder fixing the pipe while I watch my cat videos, thinking inside myself as the cat's going left and right on the YouTube video, not really watching it. My eyes are glazing. The pipe's being, I can hear the wrench moving over my shoulder. My eyes are glazing, but I'm saying deep down in my sentimental part, wouldn't it be nice to be that skilled, to fix my own pipes, to be a plumber? I thought I could be a plumber one day. Yeah, that was a while ago. Oh, those were the days when everything was possible. That sort of wish talk is sentiment, and that's as close to the mystical as the person who has left dialectics but is trapped in the numinous can be. And Kierkegaard captured that in Fear and Trembling. He called all the Hegelian system mediation. He called Christianity the truth and the mystical, but what was separating the mystical from day-to-day life was the Hegelian mediation. All the people thinking they understood what everything meant. In other words, using the complexity as veil to talk themselves out of going to church, participating in the ritual. So all they have is these little talks to themselves of, oh, I wish I could be so skilled like that. But you know what? It's nice that he's willing to come and work and I can call him. I really admire those people. You know, they're great people. And before long, they're talking about them as if they were Greek soldiers. That sort of thing feels like you're participating in the heroic nature of being a plumber, but you're not. And it's a great deception. It's ironic.
Yes.
That even with the sentiment of feeling we're blessed to live in a world where people have such skill. We're blessed to live in this post-pagan society where some people believe in God. Having that feeling, that sentimental feeling, is not the same thing as having the faith of a Christian who believes in God. You're admiring the people who believe in God is not the same thing as having the belief in God. It doesn't bring it over to you. You have to participate with the Christians to get the faith of the Christians. You can't admire them. Yeah.
I think it was brilliant. I think sentimentalism is very dangerous. I think sentimentalism is a sort of counterfeit of emotion and beauty. It makes me think of how Scruton was concerned about kitsch. He talked about kitsch, the garden gnomes, as making us, if you fall for that, then you can't do beauty. And it's very to confuse sentiment with beauty is to basically set yourself on the road of well to hell, because it seems like you're not, though. It's sentimental, it's sweet, it's kind, it's nice, but Anselon, oh no, he's not safe, but he's good, right? There's a danger. Love and nice are not similes. One is in trouble if you conflate nice to the guy at the counter with love, right? The danger of sentiment is it's a lower resolution of a truth, which then makes you think that it is the truth, but it's not of the higher quality, which then can train you to lose the capacity for higher quality and thus leads you to a damnation, right? Because it's gradually training you out of greater capacity. We were saying great art trains you into greater capacity, sentiment trains you to less capacity, and then you lose the capacity to tell you've lost the capacity. I think also, please, Matthew.
Well, now I want to ask you the question, which you asked us earlier. If that is so, it's this lower register, it trains us not to want to be trained anymore. We think our best years are behind us. Sentiment feeds nostalgia.
Mm-hmm.
And nostalgia leaves excuses everywhere for sentiment to exist. And those two things together, sentiment and nostalgia, they give birth to the child of the unlived life.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Where my whole life feels like it's an unlived life.
Yeah.
Because I'm oscillating between nostalgia for the past.
Yes.
And this fawning sentiment for the present that doesn't allow me to want to step into the future. And those two things equal an unlived life.
Yeah.
It's a disembodiment.
Mm-hmm.
They're constantly pulling the intellect from the body, even though they might not look like it. They might look like unphilosophic moves, but they're doing philosophic damage. Yeah. Therefore, I ask you the question, Daniel. How do we learn to train ourselves to see these boundaries and stay in the quality that creates rather than in the after effects? The question you asked earlier, I'm asking you.
Oh, yeah. Be like Jesus. Work really hard to do that in the Holy Spirit, because Jesus is the revelation of the boundary condition of God is not a wall. So there's something in which the person, you see, this is why I was thinking to. So there's a few things. First, there's this idea that the feeling of sentiment feels like emotion, but it's not, right? Also, there's this idea that sentiment and nostalgia, that's a boundary too, right? The past is from me. It's a noumenon sort of thing. All of these counterfeits have a certain noumenon to them. The sentiment keeps me from the emotion. Nostalgia keeps me from now. It's in the past. It's creating all of these walls. But the irony, because you were alluding to a certain irony, like the noumenon, people like that idea because it feels like it's getting at things. But the whole idea is that you don't get at things. Like, why do people like the noumenon? Oh, it's the truth. We can't get to things in of themselves. Is that getting at things in of themselves? Is like, why do you, what? Like, the moment you talk about the noumenon, you're talking about, I like it because I get that. I get that. But here's the problem. The noumenon, there's no taking in. That's it. We said at the beginning, great art is trying to give you the taking in and not just the thing. The noumenon is saying there is no taking in. That the taking in keeps you, things, you don't take in things. Taking in keeps you from things. So the noumenon is anti-art at its finest, but you see, when you talk about art as taking in, I don't get it. So I'd rather you just tell me the art is I like the art that demands nothing of me. I just look at it. It's a perfect painting, right? Okay. That's the truth. Great. No demanding of capacity, right? I prefer that. Well, the noumenon, here's the irony. The noumenon, in saying that you can't get to things into themselves, actually is saying you've got things. Because if you can't get to things in of themselves, you've got all there is to get. So it's actually a form of art realism in that bad sense. Like, that's the joke. If you can't get to things in of themselves, then all there is the things that you're experiencing. So that practically is the thing in of itself, right? So there is no training of capacity. Like, that's the joke, is like the noumenon caught on as an idea because it felt like you were getting at things, and yet the whole idea is that you don't get at things. That's the irony of the notion. That is the irony of the notion. It's the irony for Hegel of dialectical thinking that never moves to the speculative. You think you're going somewhere. No, you're not. You're just going back and forth in the dialectic. And that's Kierkegaard too. It's like you're not actually going, right? So there's a few things. All right. So there's the question of how does one go about the going? Well, so this it goes back to the question of sex. So I think you're right on what you're saying. It seems like there's always sacrifice. So maybe a way. So the question is, what is it? The quality of, so everyone is religious because everyone has a relation to boundary. Everyone has an idea of the quality of the boundary, and everyone sacrifices. And the meaning of and maybe we could say sacrifice is work. You know, physics will talk about work, right? Okay, so there's a way that there's work. So there's boundary, understanding of the quality of boundary, and work. And if you believe in a noumenon, then the possibilities of your work are different than if you don't believe in a noumenon, right? So the meaning of sacrifice changes. Because here's the thing, if sacrifice can bring you deeper into mystery, then it's probably less likely to lead to egotism, status, and yourself, right? Before I forget, I think the noumenon, so Godot is an example of where you end up in Kant. The other is a Thomas Pynchon novel, The Crying of Lot 49. That is that's exactly like kept from the conspiracy, kept from the trumpet, you lead into paranoia because Odysseus, he can see, but he can't relate. He's stuck in this entrapment. So it's not by chance that Kant led to conspiracy land, because that's where you're going to get. You're alone. You're in a great mystery. You're in a great, meta conspiracy, but it's not mystery. Conspiracy seems like mystery, but it is not. It's paranoia. But, paranoia is the counterfeit, just like sentiment is the counterfeit and all of these different things, right? But paranoia feels like grasping mystery. So you're susceptible to that. And without relationship, your food will be poisoned. You won't eat it. You'll fall into this trap because relation can get you out of it. So what seems to be is perhaps what it is what's interesting is with Jesus, the sacrifice of Jesus changes the meaning of the boundary condition. And maybe this is what civilization without the sacrifice of God per se leads to Kant. But if you take God coming as man, then the boundary is not a hard boundary. God can become man and man can become God. So it's a veil. Oh, it's a porous noumenon. If it's a noumenon, it's a moving one and it's porous, right? So if you have a civilization where your God doesn't come to you, which is inherently work for God, of course, and it's certain like sacrificial, right? Then you seem destined for noumenon thinking, right? And then forms of Christianity that did not have a robust Christology of the incarnation and a robust doctrine of sanctification, then of themselves could head into noumenon directions. And then that led to different problems. So we're in an age now of changing our relation to the boundary, of which, of course, your Christology changes the boundary. It changes, like what you think Jesus is, changes the boundary, the quality of the boundary you're relating to. And a world without Christ, they don't have an option on the table for a porous boundary. Like it's not an option on the table in a way that is certainly self-giving, certainly not relational. I mean, you can get into various, I suppose, transcendental emergentism or stuff that people like Vervaeke and them are working on to try to bring a certain anti-Kantianism participation. kind of going on. That's all well and good. But without the person of Christ coming and sacrificing, you have the issue of course, forming a religion that can gather people together that then have the model of Christ. That's why I think this is why, for me, it comes down to, like, one, how does one do this? You need someone like the model of Christ. If I say to you, well, we need to move beyond Kant into complexity theory or forms of emergentism and so on and so forth, it's like, well, okay, how do I do that? What does that look like? What is the action that should follow from this that would have me participate that would bring about a community and certainly social practice? That's kind of an issue you get into. And why should you ever think, though, that ultimately all that would lead to a cross? That there's something about a cross too that seems to be quite pivotal to it. Well, because the person of Jesus does it, right? And that's kind of a model that comes forth. But in Christ, in Christianity, the boundary changes its quality. And in changing its quality, it changes the character of sacrifice and work in the system. And then it also suggests that every iota of creation can participate in that creative process, because if God came to the universe, then the universe can participate in God in that way, right? So the rap beat can open into song. Nothing has to be lost. Every sheep can be found. Every iota of creation can be worked into song with the right relation to the constraint. And then, of course, that also is inviting you into a kind of movement. It is inviting you to move in different things. And I would say the AI, you were saying with the AI, I do view AI as, to use Alex and Andrew's work, as a certain causer. Like, and what I mean by causer, this is a significant moment, because the AI, AI is the logical end to Kantian metaphysics, where you have to choose to see it through, which means the human ends, or you say this is faced with the undeniable future that Kantianism is leading you to, as the Feng Noumenon, as Nick Land would say. We'd say, no, we're not going to do that. And that no then means, okay, then we have to change. We can't believe in the Noumenon anymore. We have to believe that actually humans can participate in creation in a way distinct from AI. Now, so in Belonging Again 2.1, we talk about AI as the causer, and we describe that as the causer, because what Andrew and Alex will talk about in their book on story is that a story begins at the causer, which is when, the way we talk about is when a protagonist realizes irony, and that therefore they have a choice. So to explain that, let's say you have a cat. This is the example from the book that we use. Let's say you have a cat that doesn't want to be domesticated, wants to be freed by the owner, okay? So the cat tears all the curtains, it acts crazy, and the owner just loves the cat all the more. And the cat's like, well, then I need to be crazier. So then it tears the wires out of the walls and does all of this different stuff. And the cat, and the owner won't let him go. And one day the cat looks out the window and it sees a dog go up to the owner who's sweet and kind and wants to be pet. And the owner doesn't pay it into any attention. And the cat has a revelation. Oh my gosh, my owner wants a wild cat. That's the kind of cat the owner wants. I was doing the very thing that made me domesticated, thinking that would be what freed me from domestication. So the cat's irony, the causer is seeing the owner with the dog. That's the causer, which then makes visible the irony, which now means the cat has a choice. The cat has to then learn to be sweet. The cat has to learn how to be nice. But the cat has no training in that. The cat's never done that. And this is why it's funny. Because now the cat has to learn how to do something it's never done and that it doesn't even want to do. The whole reason it was acting wild is because it doesn't want to be domesticated. But now the way that it escapes domestication is to act like a domesticated cat, which is what it doesn't want to do. And that's funny. And so the question of the story is, does the cat at the end go, actually being domesticated isn't so bad, I like this, and that's precisely when the owner doesn't want it, so then it's a tragedy? Or does the cat in its domestication get freed and then it's happy and so it's a comedy, right? The story begins at the causal, the realization of the irony, okay? So human beings, in my opinion, are actually reaching the causal point in history, where we are seeing the irony that how we define true knowledge was precisely that which kept us from true knowledge. It precisely the noumenon that we thought was getting at things in of themselves is what's artificiating in intelligence. And now, in seeing that irony, we are forced to make the choice on if we're going to change, if we're going to actually be participatory or not, or have knowledge by love, planier, counter, and like we're at the causal. And I would also say this is a historic kind of unfolding because, to go really far back, there's an argument to be made, like E.O. Wilson talks about this. What's the difference between dolphins and humans? Well, dolphins don't gather around fires. Like, why, if you think about it, why didn't dolphins become as smart as human beings? There's actually no reason they shouldn't have, like from a purely biological standpoint. It's because they couldn't gather around a fire and tell stories. This is what E.O. Wilson says. He says they didn't have thumbs, so they couldn't build fires. Human intelligence is fundamentally social. This is what E.O. Wilson wants to say. Like the evolution of humans through history is a social evolution. And basically what we've done since Kant is try to be dolphins. Because dolphins are atomistic intelligences. They're not really social. They don't socialize like humans. Once we gathered around a fire, then we started telling stories, and then our brains got bigger, and you created society. Oh, and then you get to Mary Douglas, where once you have social intelligence, you can then create authoritative categories, and then that leads to the entire human. That was a lot to say. But basically, the argument I would like to make is we have forgotten that human intelligence is a fundamentally social phenomenon. That's what made us human. And we have moved toward actually trying to be like dolphins ever since Kant, basically, which means it's an unsocialized intelligence, which then that choice is leading to AI. And at AI, you're going to be called to say, are we going to admit that we made a mistake to associate intelligence with a dolphin formation and evolution of intelligence? Or are we going to change and go back to a social-based, campfire-based human intelligence? And that's the choice we now have to make. But it's going to be hard. You said this. It's going to be hard because we have to admit we were the creators of our situation, that we were ironic, that everything that we thought was going to extend humanity is precisely what is leading to our replacement. And that's going to make us pathological. That's going to be humbling. That's going to require us to change our thinking. That's going to require us to move to an embodied thinking. Well, we just spent 20 years programming, sitting at a desk. We have no training in the body. We haven't done golf in a long time. So we don't want to do this. But if you don't do this, then it's a tragedy. The causal of AI, this is the key. In the story, when you see the irony, the causal is when you decide, are we going to be a tragedy or a comedy? A happy ending or a sad ending? AI is an opportunity as the causal to choose to change what we associate humanity with from a noumenon to a veil, to a participatory knowledge. This is the opportunity. So AI could be an opportunity, and I think that's what you said. AI could unveil to us the shortcomings of the noumenon. That's exactly right. But it must be hard because the only way to see the shortcomings of it is to admit our shortcomings in making it thus and over-identifying with it. But if we can so humble ourselves, then it could be a causal that leads to a regaining of that social intelligence, of which the path of AI could enhance. It doesn't have to be a mistake. All things could be new. All things could be brought into the story if we would only make the right, choice at the causal. But that will be hard. And ultimately, I guess what I would say is we've been alluding to, basically every religion, in a sense, comes down to the question of is it a disabling binding, or is it an enabling relationship? Like modernity has been a disabling binding. We are bound to certain dynamics. We are disabled. But Christ is an enabling relationship. Great art is an enabling relationship. The great encounter of the tomato in the garden is an enabling relationship. That is possible because of a change in the quality of the boundary and the constraint that then changes the unfolding of the creativity that thus follows from that constraint, that invites us to be in a taking in that is a training of the soul versus a degradation of disablement of eye candy. And that is the dopamine. That is the attentionalist economy that is killing our awareness in the Simone Weil, the Illich, and the McKilgerquest sense. That is necessary if we're going to actually prove prepared for the culture of AI to make a choice at its moment to move in the direction of extending humanity versus be replaced by humanity. Because what we've been doing for a long time, then I'll give it to you, and I do probably have to run. I'm sorry. In a few minutes, please. I not to jump from the computer, but I will have to go for work and things. But we've let the noumenon as a philosophy of boundary. We are being replaced by the noumenon. We chose a noumenon that's steamrolling us. Nick Land is right. It's a feng noumenon. It's a noumenon. The noumenon is fenged. It is going to eat us in a sense. It's going to, but it but we can change our relationship to the boundary. We can change our philosophy of boundary, which then Christ invites us into in his sacrifice. The boundary is not what you thought. The veil is torn. You are invited into a relationship of which is the necessary thinking for us to be prepared for the causer of AI so that we make the choice in its midst to extend our humanity versus have it be replaced, so that we move from a disabling binding to an enabling relation. But please, Matthew.
Well said. We could stop right there with what you had said for all. I mean it. That was beautiful. I just some closing remarks.
Please.
What you said reminds me of how important life is and the energies of a human being. But where am I coming from when I say this? The cat in the house tearing up everything because it thinks by this behavior I will be set free corresponds to the archetype of the romantic in the last 400 years. If I outpour these emotions in strained voice, in a sort of irrational cacophony, I will scratch up all the furniture of these mechanistic, nomological, Greek, Platonic forms in my way. And then they'll let me out so I can be a noble savage in purity. Well, it's not working. I still hunger and I thirst. And I want to be around my niece and nephew and my aunt, and I want a family. And gosh darn it, I can be a romantic when I'm alone with a piece of paper and pen or feather. But after a few hours, I want to be with my family and I want to go have friends and I want to go to the pub and I want to go do some manual labor and I want to be a human being in society again. Ugh, that nomological. Why won't it leave me alone so I can be alone? Then it looks out the window and it finds its object of imitation. The dog running up to slobber the owner with affection. Okay, the causer, as you said. I take these things as placeholders for the following. In the Garden of Eden, there was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and there was the tree of life. There did not seem to be a barrier to the tree of life. There was a commandment given to not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So life is not something to be afraid of, nor is it something to think we have scant access to. And so every little bit of life we get, we better preserve it. We better figure out a way to make it stretch. We should try to copy life. Copy, copy, copy. So that today is like tomorrow and tomorrow is like the next day after it. And all these days are just preciously the same. Because we don't want to lose what we've got going now. And so we should replicate it. Every day should be like today. That seems like more life, but it's less life. It's more the same and none of the new. So it's a net loss. So it seems that Christianity is teaching us that life is good and life is abundant, and life is always going to be there around the corner. Now, if we want to exercise our capacity as human beings made in the image of God to reach around the corner before stepping there, we can exercise the faculty of our faith and hope and accessing through our intellect the invisible around the corner that we visibly cannot see yet. We can interact with those truths via the intellect through faith and hope. Before we finitely, physically turn the corner and see with our eyes the scars on Jesus, as Thomas did. But both are open to us. But if life is going to go on and on and on, the question is not, how do I keep life? The question is, what do I do with my life? How to live? Not from 0 to 1, I'm dead, how do I live? But how, given that I am alive, how to live? If I'm going to be doing this for the rest of my life, and the rest of my life is not going to ever end, wouldn't it be nice to sort of own that? Okay. You know what? You have to learn confidence and courage to do that. Because I have to admit to you, I'm a little afraid that life will end. I'm not talking about mortal death. I'm talking about after that, is there going to be a resurrection? I'm asked to believe. But alongside that belief, I'm asked to take up courage and believe. Now, those things, just like a golf swing, they don't come naturally. Why? Because they're part divine and part human. They're cooperations of God with us, working in us, and us working with him. To believe a little more, to have a little more courage, to not fear that life will end. My last thing on this. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus lays out this map. He says, do not, do not judge, for by whatever measure you measure, it will be measured unto you. And then he says, do not cast your pearls before swine. So which way is it? Well, we shouldn't think that we have to judge everything, otherwise it will cease to exist. Because then we'll question our own integrity of existence. Because that sort of hyper surveillance on everything will eventually come back around to us. And we might not be able to sustain our own scrutiny or withstand our own scrutiny. But if we let go of that judgment, we'll notice that, oh, God is real. He makes everything and their boundaries. A pig is not a pearl, and a pearl is not a pig. And I didn't have to judge between them. They just are what they are. And if I cast my pearl before that swine, it's going to act like a pig. It's not going to say, I've been waiting like a Disney character for so long for you to see me as I am, to see beneath my pigness. You gave me a pearl, now I'm going to become this Prince Charming and walk towards you. No, it's going to remain a pig from beginning to end and stomp on you. A wild boar. The pearls don't change the wild boar. Why? Because sentiment doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
It doesn't do a damn thing. Yeah. The border between the pig and the pearl is based on providence, not on judgment. Yeah. So don't judge, rely on providence, because that's where the boundaries are kept. Yeah. Judgment just doesn't work. It's unnecessary. Then he goes on to say, look at the birds. They don't toil, they don't sow or reap or gather into barns, but your Father feeds them. Here are these things which don't even take care of themselves. They're not worried about losing their life. And what do they get as a reward? They're fed every day. On top of that, what do they get? To fly. This whole existence is irrational. We should just get used to it. Why did God create? Because he wanted to and he loves us. Love made us. It's not It's not for any reason that would satisfy an American economist. The bird flies and doesn't have to worry about eating, and God feeds it so it can continue flying because it's done nothing good or bad. So don't worry about the food or the clothing. Also, wisdom. We might think, okay, I won't worry about food or clothing, but I should worry about acquiring wisdom. There's that whole book of Proverbs. Well, in a way, you don't have to worry about wisdom too much. Why? Because what does Proverbs say about wisdom? She stands at the gates crying out to you, saying, simple ones. I'm not talking to the wise people. Simple ones. Listen, I'm talking to you. Do you want to stop being simple? Come. I've already made the food. All you have to do is sit down and open your mouth. You don't have to do anything. Okay, so I guess wisdom's kind of going to take care of me. When I need it, it's going to knock me over the head and say, here I am. It's going to yell at that's not a very refined place for wisdom to be. I thought she has to be up in palaces. She's at the gate screaming to the simple ones. There's another kind of figure in the Bible that does that too, and that's a bad figure that leads people down into the depths of Sheol. Okay, so I can be tempted by the bad seduction or the good one. Either way, they're both coming for me. So I guess I don't have to worry too much about being tempted because that's always going to happen while I'm on earth. I don't need to go looking for temptations. They'll just come. But also, I don't have to worry about finding wisdom. It'll just come. The question is, which one will I prefer? That's pursuing wisdom, not going and looking for it, but when it comes, preferring it to the voice of the prostitute. That's the real way to seek wisdom and prefer her to choice pearls, is whenever she comes to you because she loves you, prefer her to the prostitute who acts like she loves you but doesn't. Even that, though, is not why we're here. Because what does Jesus say? Solomon, and this is my last thing, Solomon in all his glory, in all his epitome of wisdom, in his exercise of preferring wisdom to the harlot, in all his exercise of quality preference, not even Solomon, in all his glory, was arrayed like one of these, which today is and tomorrow is thrown into the fire. Okay, you built up wisdom to now say it's as transitory as flowers. You're making the problem worse for me, not always preferring wisdom to the prostitute. What is it? The food and clothing will be added to you. Wisdom's always going to be knocking out your door. I don't want to. I don't want to. Wisdom's still knocking. All I have to do is learn to say yes to wisdom. And usually that yes is going to be a yes and no to the voice of temptation. Usually they come together, right? When I say no to the temptation, immediately it's like wisdom loves us or something. The moment we say no and we think, I've given up my whole life, I've said no to the temptation. Right then and there, wisdom comes in and offers us something better that we have to say yes to. Poor us. I mean, my God, we must be made, God must love us or something. But okay, if it's not even for that, then what is it? And he says, it's to seek the kingdom of God and his righteousness. That I hear as personal relationship with God, because when you seek out the righteousness of someone, you're seeking to know their version of righteousness. You want to shoot a basket like Michael Jordan, not like anybody else. I don't want to play basketball in the generic sense. I don't want to learn like a top athlete in the generic sense. I want to play like Michael Jordan, which means I'm going to live with Michael Jordan. I'm going to eat what Michael Jordan eats. I'm going to ask him questions about why the sky is blue, because in my eyes, Michael Jordan knows everything. And I just want his reason for the sky being blue to trickle down into how I shoot this basketball. That's gaining his righteousness, his whole mindset, his whole being, so that I look and talk like him, even though I look and talk like nothing like him. That's supposed to be more important than wisdom and more important than being a hunter or gatherer. The personal relationship. I lied. I don't want the last word. You get the last word, my friend.
All of that. Well, you're a gentleman, my friend, and I've enjoyed this immensely. And I never know where the time goes, and that was all fantastic. And you said a lot that was very important. First on what you were saying about the pearls and judgment. I mean, there's a way I've thought about it is if reality is moving toward you. Like that's the question. Is it moving toward you or not? And if it's moving toward you, you don't need to judge. You'll just all you need to do is assess. Like there's the boundary, there's the distinction, right? You let reality disclose to you what's going on, right? Like the problem with judgment as well is judgment says you are a liar versus like assess said you lied. I'm not defining your essence. I'm also like an assessment. I'm also kind of just saying, yeah, that was a lie, but you're changing. And it's not like defining an essence. There's something very stagnant about judgment, right? Whereas also too, like there's a lack of belief in an unfolding that is occurring. That's like you're like this idea of wisdom coming to you. That's so important because your job is to be prepared for it, to be ready to prefer it. Well, you're not going to do that unless you think something's coming toward you, like that there's a movement to reality, which again, like we've been saying, if boundaries are creative, then there is a motion to reality because reality consists of boundaries that exist for the sake of creating movement, negentropy, right? Like the boundary is not to keep you from things, but to have things move towards you. And you figuring out how to prefer that. Now, I think that was very well put as well, because there's a funny way in which you have to say, like, read wisdom, not because you seek it, but so that you prefer it. Like, this is the odd thing, is that the way you train yourself to prefer a thing is to put yourself in the place of doing the thing, but your attitude toward it is one of a kind of humility, where you say, no matter how much I practice golf or practice gardening, at the end of the day, all that's ever going to do is maybe work on my preparation and preferences for things. But at the end of the day, the things have the last word. The creation has the last. Well, that's grace. God has to move. All you can do is prepare yourself, right? Like I like to talk about the distinction between planning and preparing. The technological mindset, the modern mindset, is one of planning. Like we need to have a mindset of preparation for the unknown, the preparation of the movement of creation, right? If God has to be the one who moves, that doesn't mean we don't have any free will. That just means our job is preparation for the movement, preparation for the receiving. And so you can see then how providence and choice go together, because you can't choose for things to move, but you can prepare yourself to prefer how things move towards you based on relating with them. Right? Where you put yourself in a place to relate to them, but ultimately all you can do is put yourself in the place where the one being wooed can move towards you. If you force the girl to love you, if you force the one, that becomes problematic. But you can do work to be in the range of the circle, where you believe in that vertical dimension of the point, the stable vanishing mediator that I don't see. Well, that's there, and because it's there, there's always the possibility of a creative unfolding that looks like love now, because I've been in that place where something can come forth anew. Ivan Illich, and I think you're wise as well to talk about courage, because I definitely think a lot of what it means to train yourself in the way we've been describing for the movement of the soul to enablement is a lot to do with courage, And that makes sense, because if you think reality moves and you're putting yourself in a place for reality to move towards you, there's a courage in that, because who knows what could come forth? Who knows what I might see in myself if I read Moby Dick or look at that painting? I might see something I don't like about myself. Yeah, well, that's purgatory. That's the purging, right? The motion of love is also the desire, as Cardinal Newman kind of put it, to take a shower because you want to be your best before beauty. Like if you knew the president was coming, you take a shower, right? Well, likewise, this is why beauty and movement entail with it a certain conviction, but it's not a guilt-based conviction. Merely the presence of something glorious makes you want to do your best to rise to its occasion, not out of guilt, but because it's fitting. The president's coming. Your parents are, if everyone's coming over for Thanksgiving, it's fitting to have the room set and to take a shower and to be clean, right? But this is why, like, wisdom, this is like you said, I'm not doing that temptation, and then wisdom offers yourself. Well, suddenly you're like, oh, I don't want that temptation. I like being clean when wisdom shows up. I like having taken a shower, right? This is nice. It would have been really embarrassing if wisdom showed up and I hadn't. That would have been hell, right? Like, God, a lot of hell is like being in God's presence and not loving him or not being ready for him, right? So that very glory of God can then be torture, right? Like beautiful things judge you, like beautiful things convict you. That's why you want to take a shower. So wisdom comes in and says, and you're like, wow, I'm glad I didn't do that temptation, because otherwise, when wisdom came in, I would have felt awful. And then it attracts you to not do the temptation. So you have that going on. And I think it does have a lot. Well, Ivan Illich, who wrote on disablement, who said the modern world was defined by an increasing disablement in a movement from subsistity to reliance on experts and technology. He said the name of the game is learning to regain the art of living. Like you were saying with life, the art of living is not merely the reproduction, but it's tied to what he called dwelling, learning how to dwell in life. In the Kairos time, the festival, the leisure, the Sabbath, the sort of dwelling, right? It makes no sense to think that our goal should be dwelling unless you think reality moves. If reality moves, though, then it's all about dwelling to be prepared to prefer what moves towards you. If you, though, believe in a noumenon where you can't access the things, a noumenon means there's a wall. Things can't move towards you. They can't cross it. It's a wall and it's sealed. All right, well, dwelling sounds pretty dumb, Illich. We got to get on planning and do it. And like, this is the world we're stuck in. It doesn't move. We're kept from things in of themselves. Let's turn it into a brave new world that's all able to solve all of our problems, including us, out of existence. The replacement of humanity before AI versus the extension at the causer. But if we believe that reality has a certain coming forth, as great art teaches us, as the movement of the soul can treat as training should be for, so that we prefer what moves toward us, then the Illich emphasis on dwelling makes a whole lot of sense. It takes a whole lot of work to dwell well. It takes a whole lot of courage to dwell well. And I think that by focusing on that, I then think that leads us to the question of this difference between doing things to avoid existential dread versus doing things to extend humanity. Because you ask yourself the question, am I doing this to avoid fear? Or am I doing this to face fear? Am I doing this to avoid dwelling, to always be busy? Or am I doing this so that I can dwell well, so that I'm able to receive and prefer what moves toward me as it moves toward me as a gift of grace and beauty? And I think that as a heuristic can be useful to determine what we should do and what we should not do, so that we may participate in that dance. And dancing takes courage too, right? Like if you go on the dance floor. So if we want to participate in that dance that moves the sun and other stars, then courage would be appropriate. Matthew, Allison, it is
I
always a
agree.
pleasure.
Always a pleasure.